Assalamu alaikum everyone, I hope you're doing well. My name is Rajab Basha. I am a third year medical student and this is the part 2 of the BHS crash course. So this is going to cover inshallah the post-midterm material. And again, just like last time, I highlighted the very high yield stuff in red. I went through the PDF content so you don't have to, and I pasted them on the slides. And I tried to make the slides as inclusive as I can. Now, one thing is that the post-mid is very different from the pre-mid, and it's a really good idea to give yourself time to study BHS. I personally gave myself a week to study it, and HNS schedule is usually a bit lighter, and you have a break, so you should utilize that for BHS as well. So, starting off with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. And just a quick disclaimer is that we're going to be discussing some topics that don't really align with our cultural or societal values. And anything I say is just for educational purposes. It doesn't mean I necessarily agree with it. So we're going to be covering all these topics, which is all of your lectures, and starting off with the theories of personality. Now, why do we care about personality and psychology? It's because there's two main reasons. One is that personality is really interesting because you can have two identical twins with the same genetics, the same family, the same household, the same environment. They're going to grow up polar opposites of each other. One of them is going to be introverted, the other is going to be extroverted, stuff like that. The other reason, which is more clinically important, is because if we figure out how people think, we can know how and where to intervene. So let's say someone comes to you with anger issues. This person isn't a lost cause just because they have anger issues. If you understand personality well and if you understand psychology well, you're gonna be able to trace back the steps and see why they're feeling this way and what you can do about it. So psychologists try to answer this question of, how does personality develop using one of their main schools. Their main schools include ego psychology, which is the one Sigmund Freud talked about, and you have taken in neuro, which is, the id, the ego, and the superego. And then there's object relations, which really talks about how the bond with the mother very early on becomes the prototype for all relationships in life, whether that's being trustful of people, not being overly dependent on them, not being overly attached to them. And there's self-psychology, which we will not cover, and because it's not in the slides. And the main contributors of psychology are Sigmund Freud and his friends that we have all talked about. Otto Kernberg is also not covered in the slides. It's not in BHS content. So this is the man himself, Sigmund Freud. You can see him posing with a cigarette. And he talked about the topographic model of the mind, dream interpretation, psychoanalysis, and psychosexual development. Now, Sigmund Freud is a pretty big deal in psychology because he was responsible for psychoanalysis. He was responsible for all of these things. And while his theories are largely discredited now because they're controversial, he still set the foundation for the psychologists that will come after him. So starting off with the topographic model of the mind, and it's basically like, have you seen those pictures of icebergs where it's like the tip of the iceberg that you can see, and then underneath that you can't really see it? So that's sort of similar to it. There is the conscious mind, which is things consciously going on in your mind right now, consciously being perceived by your senses in your awareness. So like this crash course, for example. And then there's the pre-conscious mind, which is the barrier between the conscious mind and the unconscious mind. And the pre-conscious mind is things that are in your memory, but you're not actively thinking about them right now. So let's say I ask you for your phone number, or I give you an Anki card to solve. You're not actively thinking about your phone number right now. However, if you think about it, you'll be able to recall it, and it's accessible. And that's the pre-conscious mind, which is the barrier between the conscious and the unconscious. The unconscious, based on what Sigmund Freud says, is composed of repressed memories that are very deep and difficult to access. And this is things like childhood trauma, and it contains your unfulfilled wishes. And what's interesting about the unconscious is that you can bring out the content of the unconscious using hypnosis, which you've seen in movies as like the gold watch that they go right and left with until the patient is asleep. And I just want to pause here for a second and explain a bit on the unconscious. Freud really stresses the idea of having these unfulfilled wishes. And these wishes in the unconscious, they are basically the drives or the instincts that make us who we really are, right? Or they push us to do the things that we do. And he was very concrete about it. He was very black and white about it, in that he said there are two main drives or two main wishes. There are libidinal wishes, coming from the word libido, and there are aggressive wishes, obviously coming from aggression. So libidinal wishes, they relate to reproduction, biologically, but then they also relate to things important for survival, which you're going to see in just a second. And then there's aggressive wishes, which Freud says includes things like the concept of murderous rage, which is when you're so angry at someone that you want to physically harm them. And obviously, these two wishes that we've just mentioned tend to be socially unacceptable. And that's why they're in the unconscious and they're repressed, and we keep them, literally at the back of our brain. And moving on, let's just remember that the unconscious is this dynamic entity, and it's all about the pleasure system. So these two wishes we mentioned, both libidinal and aggressive, when we meet these wishes, when we fulfill them, we get pleasure, we become happy, okay, according to Freud. And the unconscious is characterized by primary process thinking. Now, when we say primary, that means there's obviously a secondary. And so primary process thinking is your actual thoughts, thoughts in the unconscious mind that are they're basically a mess. They're unorganized, they're chaotic, and they're often made of these unacceptable wishes. When the brain acts on them, it's called secondary process thinking, which is more organized, and you start thinking about something actively, right? So this model, however, the topographic model, was discredited eventually because it didn't explain defense mechanisms or the unconscious need for punishment. And defense mechanisms, we know it's a function of the ego, and that's more about the ego psychology, which is, I guess, our preferred model now. And then topographic model of the mind never explained the unconscious need for punishment. So, for example, some people, they feel really guilty about life, and they have this need to be punished for things. Okay? Now, we just said that the unconscious is governed by the pleasure system. It wants pleasure, it wants happiness. So how can there be happiness in punishment? That's also why this model was discredited. And these are the slides, just to make it inclusive. And so Sigmund Freud really takes off with this concept of psychoanalysis when he discusses the case of this woman called Anna O. And Anna O is this woman who, first of all, she's this neurotic woman, as described by Freud. Neurosis, or neurotic, coming from the word neurosis, means anxiety and those things, mental distress. She was very attached to her father, and her father unfortunately developed a stroke. He became debilitated, he became paralyzed. Because Anna O was so attached to her father, she started to have the same symptoms that he had. He couldn't move his hand, she couldn't move her hand either. This was really interesting, and that's why Sigmund Freud and his colleague started to work with Anna O to try and figure out what exactly is going on. Now, Sigmund Freud's colleague was the primary therapist for Anna O. And there was something about the bond between the patient and the therapist here. Anna O thought that the therapist reminds her of her father. Okay, and that is something called transference, when the patient projects some feelings onto the therapist. And countertransference is the opposite. It's when the therapist projects feelings onto the patient. So, for example, maybe the therapist can feel like the patient reminds him of his own son, so he's going to start being more fatherly and protective to him. Stuff like that. So, again, going back to the case of Anna O became very attached to her therapist, and she started believing that they were in love, and in reality they weren't. However, Anna O, she was so infatuated with her therapist that she eventually developed somatic symptoms, and she believed she was pregnant from him, and she had a larger stomach. It physically became so that her stomach expanded as if she was actually pregnant. But this just shows you how the brain can actually do so much more than we think. And this is when Sigmund Freud did the concept of psychoanalysis, and it's the stereotypical therapist we see in movies, where the therapist is sitting on a chair away from the patient, and they're just taking down notes while the patient just keeps going on and on and on and on, and that's called free association, when the patient lets his own his own thoughts roam freely. And upon working with Anna O, Sigmund Freud discovered some defense mechanisms like resistance and repression. Now, resistance is, to give you the definition, it's an unconscious defense mechanism. All defense mechanisms are most defense mechanisms are unconscious, actually. We're going to be talking about that later. But resistance is one unconscious defense mechanism where the person does not want to discuss painful memories or trauma. Let's say you are the therapist and you ask the patient about a traumatic experience. Suddenly, the patient is going to start feeling very sleepy and like they need to go home, right? So they resist, the brain resists reaching into this painful memory and starts making excuses. And this is all unconscious. The patient is not aware of that. But they suddenly feel sleepy, they suddenly feel like they need to go, for example. And then we also have repression. Repression, we have talked about previously, is when a person unconsciously puts a lid on a painful memory and really stores it deep down in the brain, just at the back of the brain. And remember that it's unconscious because we're going to be talking about suppression next, which is conscious. Okay? And Freud was also known for his entire ideas of frustration, or what we call in Arabic al-kabt, when we say someone is makboot. That was Sigmund Freud, actually. And Sigmund Freud also talked about dreams and the interpretation of dreams. So he said that, again, like with everything regarding Freud is an unconscious childhood wish that wants to be fulfilled. So he said that a dream is the disguised fulfillment of an unconscious childhood wish that is not readily accessible to conscious awareness in waking life. Right? For example, let's say, actually we have examples on it later on. The actual events of the dream are the manifest. So let's say you dream about going to a festival. That is going to be the manifest, the concrete events, without any interpretation, without any explanation. The actual events themselves are the manifest. When you take the events and you start pondering them, you start interpreting them, that's called the latent or the dream work. That's basically the meaning behind the dream. And dreams are the foundation of ego psychology because dreams are this gateway that lets you look into what your id and what your ego want. Okay. So dreams are an interplay of several concepts. We have condensation, displacement, and symbolic representation. Condensation, in English, when you condense something, you take something and you condense it. Condensation is a composite of multiple people or things, right? So let's say you're having a dream and you meet someone in the dream. And this person, they can look like your brother, however, they speak like your friend, and they have the same hair as your teacher, right? So that's like a composite of multiple people, so that's condensation. Okay. Displacement is when there are specific feelings that you will redirect onto something else. So, for example, let's say that you are fighting with someone and you feel really upset about it. You're going to go home, go to sleep, and you're going to dream that you're fighting with someone else. So let's say you fight with your boss. In your dream, you're fighting with your mom, for example. Okay, that's displacement. Symbolic representation is, for example, let's say you're sad, so you're going to be dreaming about clouds and rain and stuff like that. That's symbolic. And then dreams are primary process thinking, and the interpretation of dreams is secondary process thinking, which is secondary vision. And I believe we have already talked about this. Primary are just wild and unkept, and then secondary process thinking is when you do some revision, you interpret what the dream means, you think about it for a second. And now the bulk of Freud's work is all about instinct and drives. And as we said, there are libidinal drives, and there are aggressive drives. And he says that these drives are species specific and genetically derived, and you don't need to learn them. And this is high yield. They are independent of learning. No one teaches you to be hungry and eat. It's something you already know. So to give you an example on what a specific instinct is like, instincts are made up of 4 characteristics. There's the source, the impetus, the aim, and the object. So the source of an instinct is the organ from which the instinct arises. So let's say you are hungry. In this case, the source would be your stomach. Your stomach feels empty. It's gonna, cause hunger. The impetus is the intensity of the urge, eye for eye. impetus is intensity. So it's basically, on a scale of 1 to 10, how hungry are you? Are you hungry enough to go and make a sandwich? Or are you just going to wait until lunch? That's your impetus. The aim is the action directed towards tension release. If you're hungry, your aim is going to be to eat a sandwich, right? This action, eating the sandwich, is going to release the tension, which is hunger. Okay? The object is the target or the person. So in this case, in the example we have, the object here is the sandwich. The aim is eating the sandwich. Okay? I hope that does make sense. And Freud described child development in the context of organs. So there's the oral stage, which is from 12 to 18 months, and the anal stage, 18 to 36 months, and the urethral stage, the phallic stage, 3 to 5 years, the latency stage, which is from 5, 6 to 11, 13 years, the genital stage from 11, 13 years onwards. Now, let's just pause here for a second. We just said that Freud talked about instinct, and he talked about organs being the source behind the instinct. So Freud really cares about organs, and he assigned each organ a specific stage. Okay? We're going to go over them right now, starting with the oral stage. Now, however, each stage has its own goals that need to be met, its own criteria that needs to be fulfilled, and pathology can arise if these needs are not met. So, to explain, we have the oral stage, and so keep in mind that this is from 12 to 18 months. What does this mean? This is an infant, and infants, they can't really do much except eat. An infant just really cares about eating, and feeding and eating is all from the mouth. That's why it's called the oral stage. And what's important here is that the infant is totally helpless. If the infant gets hungry, they're not going to go up and microwave some food. They're going to cry. Now, if the infant is in a good household, the mom is going to hear the infant crying and she's going to feed him. And that basically, if it happens enough, it teaches the infant that the world is safe, right? So the infant feels hungry, he cries, someone will come for him, someone will save him, right? So the oral stage is about trust. And Freud also says that the oral stage is centered around feeding. Freud talks of the oral triad, which is the wish to eat, to sleep, and to reach that final satisfaction after suckling just before the onset of sleep. And this is the oral triad. And as we said, each organ will have, or each drive is really two components. It's a libidinal drive and an aggressive drive. So the mouth, the way I think about this is that the mouth can do two things, right? So the mouth can either say nice things or it can say bad things, okay? The mouth wants to feed, and if it doesn't really feed, it starts crying, it starts biting and chewing and getting aggressive. Now that we said all of this, how does this relate to psychology, right? So children that are fed adequately, children that are fed adequately will grow up trustful of the world. Now, children, if they are underfed, they become oral sadists that are demanding, envious, and jealous. These are people that they have never received enough, so they become demanding, they become envious, they become jealous of other people because they have never known what it's like to have enough. Meanwhile, children who are overfed, they become spoiled, they become oral dependent. So they're overly optimistic, up to across the healthy boundary. They are overly dependent and needy, and they may give excessively in the hopes that others will give back to them. Okay? And you guys must have seen or must have heard about how Freud says that people have this oral fixation. So for example, someone that is constantly chewing gum, someone that is constantly smoking, they probably have a problem with the oral stage, and that's why they have this oral fixation that needs to be met, And this is the PDF, and I believe we have covered all of it. However, please still go over the PDFs and read them. And the character traits in the oral stage is that successful resolution of the oral phase will provide a basis in character structure for capacities to give and to receive from others without excessive dependence or envy, and a capacity to rely on others with a sense of trust. Okay? So it's about not being an overly dependent person and also learning trust. Now let's talk about the anal stage, which is the second stage. And again, you guys know how previously you had to know the order of each stage. If I can ask you, what's the second stage? You'll have to tell me it's this stage, the anal stage. And it's from 18 to 36 months. And the mnemonic here is A for A, so anal for autonomy. And just to explain the concept here, um, infants, or I mean in this case toddlers, they don't really have control over their situation, right? So if an infant wants to go to the mall, but the family wants to go to steakhouse, and I the infant isn't going to drive himself there. They can, however, according to Freud, they can control one thing, which is their anal sphincters, and it's when they go to the bathroom, when to karama. This is how infants learn autonomy. What does autonomy mean? Autonomy means that I am my own person. You know, nobody tells me what to do. I can do whatever I want, whenever I want. That's autonomy. Okay? And obviously, for these toddlers, it's going to be about going to the bathroom because they don't really have control over anything else. So we talked about autonomy, but we also have to talk about control. Now, it's again, as we said, it's all about controlling the sphincters. And basically, two things can happen here. um, let's say that kids or a kid, you know, as kids do, might sometimes make a mess. It will be an accident, يعني. If the parents are overly harsh and critical, what's going to happen is that the child will learn to have increased control. You know, they're going to be too controlling of themselves, and when they grow up, this will manifest as being, you know, neat freaks. So they're going to be all about orderliness, stubbornness, and frugality. They're going to be very stubborn people. They're going to be يعني, control freaks, basically. And then we have the other end of the spectrum, which is decreased control. These are people that were probably not potty trained by their parents until later on. Their parents just didn't really care. For these people are going to be, they're going to have a lack of tidiness. They're going to be messy. They might have rage and sadomasochistic tendencies. And again, this is the PDF. Please go over it. And one interesting thing is that if you don't correctly solve the main issue in each stage, it's going to carry over as emotional baggage for the other stages. That's why we were saying, Yani, someone may not have been fed adequately as a child. They're going to grow up and become an overly demanding person. Okay? They carry over. And yes, the main thing here is autonomy, personal initiative without guilt, and without a sense of shame or self-doubt. Okay, please remember the anal stage has to do with autonomy. Then we have the urethral stage, which is this transitional stage between the anal and the phallic stages, and it's mainly about pride, competitiveness, and setting the foundations for gender identity. The issues may be about control and shame. Now you're going to see some overlap between the stages. Like for example, هلا من شوي in the second stage, in the anal stage, we were talking about control. So here it's also saying control. Expect this overlap صراحة, and this is why you need to go over the material twice. However, if this came in the exam and you had both, like the vignette was talking about control, and you had both anal stage and urethral stage as answer choices, I would صراحة pick anal stage for control. Shame and pride, maybe they have more so to do with the urethral. Pride definitely is more about the urethral stage. So you can just read this on your own. It's not really high yield. But please read it. Now we talk about the phallic stage, which is from 3 to 5 years, and that's super high yield. Now the phallic stage is where the bulk of Freud's work went, and Salaha is the most controversial part. And basically, first of all, in Greek or Latin, I'm not sure, phallic or phallus means male organ. Okay, so this stage is all about the phallus, the male organ. And the principal issue in this stage is attaining the mother's love. Okay? And Freud discusses that this is the stage where there are unconscious, repressed, reproductive wishes with the opposite gender parent. Okay? And obviously, yani, the child does not know all of this, yani. That's why Freud says it's unconscious and repressed. Now, in boys, we're going to talk about in boys and in girls. So for boys, there's what's called the Oedipus complex. Oedipus was this like Greek or Roman entity, and basically, Oedipus was this boy that loved his mom. Freud builds on this, and he says that boys, they tend to love their moms, and you know the marriage way, for example, right? Boys want to grow up and marry their moms. However, there is the presence of this, stronger, more dominant male who is the dad, and the boy eventually becomes afraid of the dad, and becomes afraid that if the boy, according to Freud, if the boy pursues the mother, the father will catch the boy and will do this thing called castration, which is removal of the organs. The boy becomes depressed and comes to the conclusion that خلاص, um, if he cannot get with the mother, he will find someone that resembles the mother instead. And this is the Oedipus complex. And basically, you see this like love triangle here, where two people are basically fighting for the same person. And so that's why in psychology, if someone comes to you with recurring love triangles, maybe they have a problem in the phallic stage, and that's maybe something they can ask. And in girls, it's called the Electra complex. Now, Freud was basically reaching when it came to girls. He was basically stumped. He couldn't really explain it, but this is what he came up with. He said that girls go through the Electra complex and they complain of this thing over here, and the girl will feel inferior because, so for example, the girl wants to receive the mother's love. However, the girl is not as worthy as the dad. Why? Because the dad has something that the girl does not have. And so this is what Freud calls genital inferiority, and it has three outcomes. Either that the girl will grow up with no sexuality, or with normal sexuality, or with hypermasculinity. Okay? In both boys and girls, they basically grow out of this phase because they fear that they will do something that will upset the mom's love. They're like, خلاص, I'm just not gonna come between the mother and the father. And what's important here and what's super high yield is that this is the stage where kids leave with having laid foundations for a strong sexual identity and developing a superego. Okay, this is where the superego happens. Why? Because we know that the superego is all about what's right and what's wrong. So obviously, after what we just said, there's going to be something in the brain that says that this is wrong and you should not do this. This is the PDF. I think we have covered most of it. Just please read it again. Then we have latency stage. Latency in English, it means just a break. So there's nothing really major happening here. It's just from this time period, and it is when the children will focus on skill building and learning. This is basically school age. Okay. There is consolidation of sexual identity, capacity for mastery, and autonomous initiative without worrying about failure, defeat, or inferiority. Again, a ton of overlap, but obviously if they're going to be asking about sexual identity, they might more so focus on the phallic stage. However, that's not a rule, obviously. So this is the PDF. Again, you guys know that what I'm doing is that I'm telling you what's high yield, and then the PDF is just there for you to go over on your own, because otherwise the crash course would be like 10 hours. And this is the genital stage, which is from 11 to 13 years onwards until the end of life, and is divided into pre-adolescence, early, middle, late, and post-adolescence. And this is when libidinal urges intensify and they become mature, basically. Hence the name. And this stage is where unresolved conflicts can resurface. However, they have the potential for re-resolution. Okay? Again, someone is not doomed. They have potential for re-resolution. Now, in this stage, because this is basically teenagehood. Teenagehood is when people want their own sense of identity. They want to be separate from the parents, and they will start integrating with their adult roles. Now, other than the previously unresolved conflict, the issues here include identity diffusion. Okay? PDF. And now we can talk about ego psychology. So ego psychology is about your id, your ego, and your superego. And as we said, your id is the part of your mind that wants pleasure and is governed by primary process thinking. It's these, urges and drives that Freud said that you can't really say to anyone, you can't really carry out. The superego is your moral compass, and it tells you what's right and what's wrong, and it maintains your moral sense, which is high yield. The ego is the middleman between them. Your ego is going to find a solution to reconcile between the wishes of the id and the commands of the superego. Maybe you have seen this in like Tom and Jerry when we were young, where like there's Tom and then there's like a small devil on his left shoulder and a small angel on his right shoulder, and one of them is telling him evil stuff, the other is telling him good stuff. But that's like the id and the superego. And again, you guys know that the ego works through defense mechanisms, right? It also works through control and regulation of drives, judgment, relation to reality, object relations, synthetic functions of the ego, which includes organizing and coordinating data, and autonomous ego functions. So moving on to defense mechanisms. So we have four main categories of defense mechanisms. We have narcissistic, immature, neurotic, and mature. Okay? فنarcissistic are only like three, mature are like six, but they make a lot of sense. Immature and neurotic are like 10 each. So what I did is that I memorized the narcissistic, the mature, and the immature, and then everything else was just neurotic. Okay, that should make it easier for you because they can ask and know which of these is an immature defense mechanism. And we have some good defense mechanisms, we have some bad defense mechanisms. Like the good ones are basically mature, and then everything else is not really good. So starting off with narcissistic defense mechanisms. Narcissistic, why is it called narcissistic in the first place? Because it makes it as if the person is the center of the universe, and then it changes reality to suit the needs of the person. So this includes things like denial, distortion, and projection. In all of these, there's basically lying. Hello? And all of these are unconscious, but the unconscious mind tries to change reality to suit its needs. There's denial, which we talked about in the previous model, in the previous crash course, which is when there are, like for example, someone gets a cancer diagnosis, they're going to be like, no, you're wrong, I have never felt better, they start denying it. Distortion is when people start to change reality in a way to suit their needs, which we have just been mentioning. Yani. Let's say a person goes to propose to a woman and she rejects him. He's going to go to his friends and he's going to say that, she only rejected me because she is actually super afraid of me and I'm so intimidating to her and everything. It's basically distorting reality. It's all just lies. And again, unconscious. All of these are unconscious actually. And projection is when you have feelings that you project them onto someone else. So let's say that there's someone that you don't really like. So instead of coming to terms with the idea that you don't like this person, your brain does something where it projects these feelings onto the person. So instead of me not liking you, I start telling myself that you don't like me. And this is one way I can justify myself not liking you by saying that, you're the cause of this, Islam. And you see these, you see projection, for example, and borderline personality disorders and narcissistic personality disorders. And these are the PDFs. Now, again, I do want you guys to go over the PDFs because they're high yield, and go over the examples I have in my notes because some of these examples are very high yield. Then we have the immature defense mechanisms, and I took the first letter out of each of them, and this is how I memorized it in second year, which is a really bad نمانة صراحة. بس AB, HIP, RSS, and hip, so kids are like hip and cool. This is about the immature defense mechanisms. So now to actually explain it, we have acting out, and acting out is basically throwing tantrums. And again, they're called immature because these are things that kids do. So if you see an adult doing them, then this is obviously an immature defense mechanism. Acting out is when someone doesn't want to do something, but they just start throwing a temper tantrum. Like let's say there's a husband and a wife, and the wife wants to visit her family, but the husband doesn't want to. So instead of saying no, he just starts like breaking glasses. He just starts crashing out. That's acting out basically. Then there is blocking, which is transiently blocking out a memory. So let's say that you're about to discuss and open up to something, okay, and it's a painful memory. As you're about to say it, you're going to forget it. And it's basically like it's on the tip of your tongue. يعني مو قادرة تطلع, right? You're going to be annoyed by this, you're going to be frustrated by this, and this is blocking, okay? Now, it sounds sort of similar to resistance. However, I think resistance is more so about, what you're feeling at the state. Blocking is that you consciously know the memory, you recall the events, the traumatic events, for example. However, the second you try to say them, you just can't. خلاص. That's blocking. And then we have hypochondriasis. Hypochondriasis, again, I think you took this in neuro. It's basically exaggerating an illness to get out of responsibilities, or because of loneliness, or because of guilt. So let's say that there's this old man with a painful knee, and most old people also they have painful knees. But this old man is basically overinflating it and over exaggerating and making it a huge problem. And he's in the ER. He's yelling at the nurses. He is being basically a sour person. And realistically, he's not doing this because he's in pain. He's doing this because he's lonely. He just doesn't really know that. Okay? And then we have introjection. Introjection is another way to say internalization. And it also includes something like identifying with the aggressor. So let's say that there is a victim being physically abused by someone. Hello, the abuser. With time, the abuser, he's always saying that you are bad, you deserve this, you deserve what's happening to you. The victim is going to carry out introjection, which is when they will start believing what they're hearing. It's not brainwashing, it's a way that the brain tries to regain control. Hello? Because let's say la samhallah, you get kidnapped, you're completely powerless in this situation. However, your brain tries to regain control by making you feel like you deserve this. Because you deserve this, you had some control over this. Like this happened because of you at the end, right? And you don't have to know all of that. Just know that introjection is another name for internalization, and it includes identifying with the aggressor. Then we have passive aggressive behavior, which is really obvious. It includes procrastination. So let's say there's a task you don't want to do, and instead of asking for an extension, you just start procrastinating it. There is regression, which is age regression, basically. And regression is basically when you go back to an earlier state of being. Let's say that there is this, very successful CEO, top of his company, respected by everyone. He goes through surgery, and it's really painful. What this person might do is that, this very independent, strong person, he's going to start crying out for his mom. He's going to ask to be spoon-fed. He's going to start sleeping with a teddy bear. These are all examples of regression when someone acts, younger. And there is schizoid fantasy, which I best describe as maladaptive daydreaming. Now, people who go through schizoid fantasy, they have probably been victims of rejection in the past. They're like, خلاص, I don't want anything to do with people anymore. I'm just going to retreat into my own imaginary world where I am basically the superhero or something, and I don't want to interact with anyone. This is not schizophrenia. This is schizoid fantasy, because they have a fantasy world inside of them, basically. Schizophrenia, they don't know that these are just imagination. These thoughts are just imagination. They think everything is real. Schizoid fantasy, they know that this is all imagination, but they still prefer to retreat into their own mental world. Then we have somatization, which is when you feel your stress as a symptom. And again, this is something we took in neuro. Someone that is stressed is going to have stomach pain or headaches. And what's interesting about somatization, as we said, that these are all immature defense mechanisms. In somatization, kids, they can't really tell you how they're feeling, right? So a kid doesn't really have the capacity to say, I was upset because XYZ, ABC. A kid will feel stressed because of an exam or something, and they're going to basically start having really bad stomach aches, okay? Or they're going to start throwing up. And you guys remember how in kindergarten everyone was throwing up all the time for some reason. And this is called somatization. As the person grows older, their ability to express themselves emotionally increases. So that's called desomatization. However, if there's something very stressful in adulthood life, that is going to cause re-somatization, where someone will go through somatization again. So they're going to start having stomach pain or headaches whenever they're stressed. And this is in the PDF. I thought I would cover it here. PDF. Moving on to the neurotic defense mechanisms. So neurotic, as we said, refers to anxiety, refers to mental distress. So everything here is really about, trying to deal with that mental distress. And starting off with controlling, and this is when you start managing and controlling things around you in order to resolve an internal conflict. So for example, let's say that there is a husband and wife, and the husband is very insecure. So instead of coming to terms with the fact that he's insecure and working through it, he's going to start controlling his wife too much. He's going to start limiting her movement, limiting who she can talk to, limiting her seeing her friends, for example. That is one example of controlling. And again, all of these are unconscious. There's displacement, which you have talked about. Instead of taking it out on your boss, you take it out on your kids, for example. There's externalization, which is like projection, but it's much more general. For the world is against the person, not just a person or two. So let's say that you have anger issues, but instead of coming to terms with the fact that you have anger issues, you start saying that everyone around you has anger issues. The world has anger issues. Okay, that's an example of externalization. Inhibition is a blocked ability. Now, inhibition sounds kind of similar to blocking. However, blocking was for thoughts and recollection of an event. Inhibition is for an ability. So let's say you are a writer, right? You write nice pieces, you publish them, you're well known. You receive some scathing reviews, you receive some really bad criticism, and it makes you just stop wanting to write. And you're able to write, بس يعني the ability is there, but your brain tells you خلاص you can't. It's not conscious. It's not like your brain is saying you're a bad writer. It's just that you're so afraid of the rejection again. You're so afraid of the criticism that your brain just refuses to write. Okay, does that make sense? So it's more about the ability rather than a recollection of an event. Intellectualization is basically intellectualization is when you focus on the facts and logic of something rather than dealing with the emotional impact. So again, last time someone gets a cancer diagnosis, they're going to spend their time looking at the statistics, researching Mayo Clinic and stuff, instead of actually sitting down with the diagnosis and accepting it. And then there is rationalization. Sorry, there is isolation first, which is when you isolate the separation. Sorry, it's when you isolate the emotions from the experience. So you are interviewing a victim about a period of assault that happened in their life. But they're going to be going into extensive detail and telling you so much without showing any emotion of it. It's not because they're heartless, it's because they're undergoing isolation. They're isolating the feelings from the experience. Rationalization is basically when you're justifying something. So we know how the MacBook Neo came out, and for example, let's say you have a new laptop, you have a new iPad, you don't need it, right? But the colors are nice. So you start trying to justify your way on why you should buy it, right? You tell yourself that it has like a 500 real discount. That should be good enough reason to buy it, right? That's rationalization. There is dissociation, which is going through a fugue state or a fugue state. I'm not sure how you pronounce this. And it reminds me of this penguin, the meme that was popular like a few months back. And dissociation is when someone basically has an out-of-body experience, and the body is on autopilot, but it's like no one is home. They're not really aware of what's happening. They're going through the motions of everyday life. However, they are not feeling anything, basically. And as we said, this is a huge state. So, for example, someone will go through dissociation. They will wake up 10 days later in an entirely different country, for example, right? With no recollection of what happened. It also includes things like depersonalization and derealization, or it includes things that, for example, drug abusers do. They try to reach this dissociative out-of-body state by abusing drugs. And in some religious practices, you can also see it. So, for example, Buddhist people, they try to reach this dissociative state through meditation. وحتى الصوفيين, they might reach this dissociative stage after like intense dhikr or something. And then we have reaction formation, which is when you have a specific feeling and you do the opposite. It's because you can't really agree with this feeling that you have. The ego just makes you do the opposite of it. So, for example, let's say that you have a coworker that you just really can't stand. You hate this person. You can't really show your aggression to them in public. Instead, you're going to be overly nice to them. And this is not a conscious choice. Again, it's something that you do without realizing. And I think you guys might remember the example Dr. Ali gave of like the boss and the secretary. And he liked the secretary, however, he could not do anything about it. Instead, he became very mean to her and he wanted to fire her. That's reaction formation. One important thing is that reaction formation is something you see in OCD. OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, is when someone has unacceptable thoughts, they're intrusive, aggressive thoughts, they get translated into something else. So, please keep this in mind. Reaction formation has to do with OCD, okay? Repression Again, we have talked about this 1 million times. It's unconscious. It's basically the entire memory gets removed. So it's not like blocking where you remember but you can't say. Repression, you don't even remember. You don't even know this happened. For repression, there is primary repression and secondary repression. And I want you to focus here. Primary repression is when something never made it to the conscious view in the first place, right? So in this case, there are the unwanted thoughts you have in your unconscious mind, and your brain just blocks them from ever reaching the conscious part of your brain. Then there is secondary repression, which is when something was in your conscious experience, like let's say a traumatic event, and your brain just can't deal with this, but it just throws it away. So that's secondary. So if it was conscious at first, it will be secondary repression. If it was never conscious in the first place, it will be primary repression. Then we finally have sexualization, which is when people assign sexual qualities to an object that is not sexual. فكمان this can be where someone, for example, someone faces loneliness. Instead of going to meet friends, this person will go and have multiple relationships with people. Okay? PDF. And then finally, the mature defense mechanisms, and we're almost done with the heaviest part. Mature defense mechanisms, we have altruism, anticipation, asceticism, humor, sublimation, and suppression. And these tend to be conscious. And these are things حتى you in your life you should plan on doing. Why are they called mature? Because they do not negatively affect your psyche. They are beneficial for you and for the people around you. Okay, they bring happiness rather than yelling at someone because you're upset. So let's go one by one. Altruism is known as self-sacrifice. It's basically you're doing things for a higher purpose. So this is you right now, for example. You are going into medicine to help people. Come on for the money, but to help people. And this is an example of altruism. You don't necessarily feel rewarded now while studying. However, in the future, you're going to be rewarded when you see that people are improving because of you, inshallah. And this is again similar to how, for example, our moms may give us the last slice of cake, even though they want it, but it's because for them they feel happier seeing us happy rather than enjoying that slice of cake themselves. Then there is anticipation, which is conscious planning of an event. So, for example, you have BHS, and it's like 3 weeks from now, but you're probably cramming, so I'm going to say tomorrow. So you're going to be studying for this, and this is anticipation, okay? Or you have an event, so you start preparing for it rather than procrastinating. Then there is asceticism, which is denial of pleasures. And this was really trendy a year ago with like stoicism and everything. And asceticism is very similar to what we do in Ramadan. We deny ourselves the pleasure of eating for a greater purpose. And humor, we obviously know what humor is. For example, an elevator gets stuck and then someone makes a joke about it rather than being afraid. Why is it nice? Because it defuses the tension, right? So it's an uncomfortable situation, and you just make the best out of it, actually. And it calms you and the people around you down. Then there is sublimation, which is channeling your energy into something better. So let's say someone really enjoys seeing blood and violence, for example. Instead of becoming a criminal, this person is going to become a surgeon, for example. That's sublimation. It's benefiting society, and the person is still meeting the wish that he has, but in a healthy way now. And then we have suppression, which is postponing. Suppression is the conscious way of doing repression. So suppression, let's say you have an exam tomorrow and you're fighting with someone important to you. Obviously, if you fight with someone important to you, you can't really focus on anything. You're going to fail your exam. So you tell yourself that, خلاص, stop. I'm going to think about this tomorrow after my exam. That's suppression. And again, suppression is conscious and it is time limited. It is time limited. Repression, خلاص, is gone. مع السلامة. PDF. Now we can talk about object relations. Before that, a quick break. Okay, so now we're going to be talking about object relations, which is the second school of psychology. And as we said, this one really depends on the relationship that babies have with their moms when they're young. And as we said, being fed by the mother acts as the prototype of object relations, and the infant will internalize this relationship with the mother and apply it to other relationships. Internalization is something you really see in object relations, and it's really important here, because the mother becomes a model for every other relationship. And There's the theory of unconscious internal object relations involving the transformation of interpersonal relationships into internalized structures. And yes, so basically, this bond with the mom is going to teach us trust, security, and reciprocity, which is important here. So the slides have this bullet point that says templates of unpleasant experience transform into positive experience of the self at 16 months. So this basically means that if the mom was inconsistent before 16 months, she has the chance to make up for it by becoming a better mother. And Kaman, it says that it's not really just one bad experience that makes a bad childhood and bad upbringing. It's more so a consistency. So, people get busy sometimes, and if the mom needs to travel away for a day or two away from her baby, that's not really going to cause any long-lasting distress. It's more so about, the consistency of the relationship. And an internalized object or relationship is not necessarily a perfect one-to-one correlation. Now, what does this mean? Let's say that a mom has 5 kids. Well, each of these kids is going to have their own relationship with the mom. And the oldest, maybe he will say that the mom was really warm when they were young. Meanwhile, the youngest is going to say that no, she was really distant and cruel. Why? Because each relationship is different and timing is different as well. So, for example, the older kid, he was the first child, but maybe he was paid more attention to. Meanwhile, the youngest, they just got bored when they got to him. And there's the concept of internalization, which occurs through introjection and identification. Now, introjection, we said it's the literal translation of internalization, and then identification, which is when you model your behavior after someone. So this is why role models are so important. And having good parents, inshallah, means that you become a good person as well. So, moving on. The main conflict in ego psychology is, when we were talking about it, in ego psychology, it was the struggle between the wishes of the id and the ego. In object relations, it's that there are multiple relationships that an infant will learn in his life. The issue is which one will have or receive the center stage, right? So there's the unconscious conflict being a struggle between different self-object affect units striving for center stage in the psyche. So you might have a really good relationship with your mom as an infant, but then you have a really bad relationship with your father, for example. So it becomes that which one really takes center stage in the brain, which one becomes the model for all other relationships. Okay. So again, having wildly different models can cause confusion, and that's why someone can grow up anxious and insecure in their relationships. So this is basically just reiterating that the relationship a baby will have with his mom is really important, which we already know. And here we have one case psychologist talking about object relations called Melanie Klein. And this is a name you should know. So Melanie Klein, she believed in object relations, but she also used Freud's theories of ego psychology. She said that the drive or instinct of feeding is going to lead to the object relation with the mom. However, according to the baby, the baby has a primitive way of thinking. The baby doesn't see one mom, it sees two moms. It sees one mom who is the good mom, who, when he cries, she comes and feeds him. And Melanie Klein calls this the good breast. And the baby also sees a bad mom who ignores him when he's crying, and she doesn't feed him. Because the mom is busy sometimes. The baby will see this as an entirely separate entity called the bad mom or the bad breast. And what happens after that is that the baby is going to, go through projection and introjection, and basically the baby feels angry towards the bad mom that's going to project that onto her. It's going to project this evil onto the bad mom. At the same time, it's going to internalize the two moms. The baby now understands that there is a good mom and a bad mom. It will fall into this paranoid schizoid position where it gets hungry and it starts crying. But it becomes so paranoid because it doesn't know if the good mom is coming or if the bad mom is coming, right? The baby basically freaks out at this stage. And at the same time, the baby is going to have this murderous rage towards the bad mom, wishing to destroy her and annihilate her. and at the same time, the baby is going to to really love the good mom. Now, when the baby is older, around 6 months, the half of the first year of life, the baby is going to put two and two together and realize that the good mom is actually the same as the bad mom. And that's why the baby falls into this depressive position where they realize that the bad mom that they so badly wanted to annihilate is actually the good mom that they love. Okay? They feel guilty, and according to Melanie Klein, yani they get depressed. Now, the drawbacks of this theory is that obviously an infant in the first year of life does not have the capacity for this abstract thinking. I mean, the baby did not tell you all of this. However, it's one theory we have to know, made by Melanie Klein. And then we also have Margaret Mather, which focuses on the infant-mom pairing in the first 3 years of life, which is the highest number to know here. It's how a child develops psychological separation from the mom in 3 phases. And we sort of talked about this in the last crash course with attachment and everything. However, here it's these 3 stages, and the third stage has 4 sub-stages, and the order of the stages is very, very high yield. So obviously, babies' brains, we said, are sort of primitive in thinking. They don't really realize that they and the mom are separate. They think they're one unit. And we start with the first phase, which is the autistic phase. Autistic here just means isolation. It's not actual autism. The baby is too young to really understand who the mother is, and the relationship is really one directional. And it's from the first to second month. The baby doesn't really understand that the mom is feeding him. It's just more so that the baby is just existing, and the mom's taking care of him. And that makes it very one directional. The baby is not giving anything back to the mom. He's not laughing, interacting with her. The second phase is the symbiotic phase. And you guys know what symbiotic means from biology. There's now a give and take relationship. And the mother and infant here, they will exist as one co-unit, And this is the phase when the infant becomes more responsive and starts playing with the mom, and actually they start enjoying each other's company. And the third stage is separation individuation. Okay? So this is divided into 4 sub-stages that you have to know in order. The first is differentiation, which means that the baby now differentiates itself from the mom. It realizes that they're separate, the baby and the mom, but it also can differentiate between the mom and strangers. So this is where stranger danger starts appearing. And the second stage is practicing. Now, practicing refers to practicing their movements. So the infant now is able to crawl and walk, and they're excited to explore. But the mom is still the home base. Like, they walk a bit, and they go back to the mom. They don't want to be away from her, basically. They're still really attached. And then we have rapprochement, which I had to Google the صراحة. It means reconciling. So you're reconciling between two facts. The baby wants independence. They want to explore the world on their own. At the same time, they really want to stay close to the mom. So what happens here is that the baby is going to display this, I don't want you, don't leave me behavior, where they're going to move away from the mom, but then run back to her crying. But then they're upset at the fact that they're near the mom, so they're gonna, pull away some more and then come back, and then, it's just a mess basically. So that's rapprochement. Then we have the fourth point, which is consolidation and object constancy. And this is basically object permanence. The baby realizes that the mother is not really going anywhere, and she's still there for them. She's still there for him. She loves him. So he can just go and explore and come back عادي. No one is disappearing. Then we have Winnicott, DW Winnicott, which we talked about in the previous model. Actually, this is the same slide حتى. So you guys can go over this. And now we're done with the first lecture. The rest of the lectures are going to be way quicker, inshallah. So let's talk about Erik Erikson. Erik Erikson, he was an ego psychologist similar to Freud, and they have some pretty converging ideas. What's important about Erik Erikson is that he covered all of the lifespan up until death. Meanwhile, Freud only did until puberty, and then he was like, خلاص, this is it. And he basically takes Freud's theories and he builds on them. So the main issue with Freud's theories that prompted Erik Erikson to make his own theories was that Freud believed that everything goes back to childhood. فخلاص, why blame people? If someone has a maladaptive trait, then they can't really be blamed for it. It's because of their parents, and obviously this is yani, not acceptable in real life. And so Erik Erikson does form the epigenetic principle. Epigenetic meaning above genetics, like it's not just genetics. He said development occurs in sequential, clearly defined stages, and each stage must be satisfactorily resolved for development to proceed smoothly. Basically, environment has a lot to do with your development, and you're not really hardwired into who you are. So, um, again, he associated the organs of Freud stages with a specific behavior, and he said that the development of the ego is a mutual regulation between growing children and the values of the culture or the society. This is why some societies it's more acceptable to do certain things compared to other societies. This is a table you can use to revise. Just ignore the virtue, focus on the basic conflict. So just to give you a quick background, we have infancy, which is trust versus mistrust, again, like the oral stage. Early childhood, which is autonomy versus shame and doubt, which is like the anal stage because of autonomy. Play age, from 3 to 6 years, which is initiative versus guilt, which coincides with the phallic stage. School age, which is like the latency period. Industry versus inferiority, where they are learning skills, again, like the latency period. Adolescence, which is like the genital stage, identity versus confusion, because we talked about identity diffusion there. And then the new stages like early adulthood, middle age, and old age. Early adulthood, intimacy and isolation. Middle age, generativity versus stagnation. Old age, integrity versus despair. Now, I want you guys to keep in mind that basically the entire lifespan, according to Erik Erikson, it's mainly centered around early adulthood, or just adulthood in general, right? Middle age, for example. So when you're young, you're preparing yourself to become an adult. So whether that's basic survival needs like feeding, like in infancy, and then autonomy, initiative, identity, and stuff like that, and the skills, and then خلاص you're an adult now. After adulthood, when you're old, you're going to be reflecting on what you did. So the center of it is just adulthood. So stage one, again, you have to know the numbers, the order of the stages, and the name. Stage one is basic trust versus mistrust from birth to 1 year, and this coincides with Freud's oral stage. And we already talked about this. Feeding teaches the infant trust. Someone will take care of them if they're hungry. And there's what's called the oral crisis in the second half of the first year, which is around 6 months. Erik Erikson says that this is when the infant starts playing a more active role in feeding. Now, instead of just passively being fed all the time, the infant realizes that they can control the environment around them. So, for example, if they bite the nipple, it gets taken away. This also teaches them that they are not joined with the mom, they are separate beings. And again, they can cause an effect in the environment. And that's the first thing, the oral crisis in Erik Erikson's basic trust versus mistrust stage. And there's the development of trust, which we have talked about. The infant will eventually internalize the mom and make her a certainty in his inner representations. Then we have autonomy versus shame and doubt from 1 to 3 years, and this is going to coincide with Freud's anal stage. And these are really high yield. The doctor likes asking about comparing between Erik Erikson and Freud. So autonomy is associated with a sense of mastery. You have mastery over the sphincters, for example, and toddlers have a sense of separateness from others, and thus can either hold on or let go, or be cooperative or stubborn. And again, you can imagine how this really relates to the sphincters. And the kid now knows that they are their own person, and for example, they know that they have choices. So if you tell the kid to go to bed but they don't want to, they're going to say no, I don't want to. So that's how they can be stubborn or they can be cooperative. Now at this stage, parents must be supportive without being overprotective. And if toddlers are punished for being autonomous, this might produce a sense of shame and doubt. Okay. Now we talk about initiative versus guilt from 3 to 5 years. So in this stage, kids will come up with some ideas of their own, and that's one example of them taking initiative. Okay, so initiative is mainly for stage 3, which coincides with the phallic stage. So the kids will come up with their own ideas, which is them taking initiative. So for example, you're cleaning the house, the kid will hold a sponge and say, I want to clean as well. Or you're rearranging your toys, and the kid is going to say, I want to rearrange them my way. And the main thing here is that we need parents to allow kids to take initiative sometime, and to come up with their own ideas. And we don't want to be excessively harsh with them, as that can lead to super ego guilt. Super ego guilt is basically when these people feel like they're carrying the guilt of the world over their shoulders. And it's a super critical super ego that makes you feel guilty about anything. So, for example, this kid wants to cook, but again, because he's a kid, he's going to make a mess. A good parent is going to tell them, "Oh, no, let me show you," and include them in cleaning up and cooking. Meanwhile, a bad parent is going to punish the kid for even trying, or خلاص لا initiative ولا أي شيء. The kid is just going to feel guilty about everything, right? And at the end of this stage, the superego is established. They have a moral sense of right and wrong. Again, just like Freud's phallic stage. Then we have the latency, which is the stage 4 industry versus inferiority, 6 to 11 years. Coincides with Freud's latency phase. And this is when they learn skills. This is when, they're at school, they're learning. And so industry, someone is industrious. That means someone is a good worker, someone is hardworking, someone, has mastery over their skills, for example. And someone that's inferior, they just can't really do anything. It's being less than others. And this can be because people are bullying you or discriminating against you, or it can be because your parents are spoiling you, and so you never learn to do anything by yourself, making you excessively dependent. Then stage 5, which is identity versus role diffusion, which is coinciding with the genital phase. It's when, in this stage, how teens, they go through so many phases, and they basically burn through hobbies and friend groups, and they just want to see what sticks. And this is when they have an identity crisis, which is normal at the end of adolescence. However, it needs to be resolved. Otherwise, it's going to lead to role confusion, someone not knowing who they are. And problems here can include problems in gender identity. And if someone doesn't know who they are, they become very sensitive to being a victim of harmful groups like cults or bad organizations. Then we have stage 6, which is intimacy versus self-absorption or isolation, which is from 21 to 40 years. And this is from late adolescence to early middle age. So intimacy in relationships, for these healthy people, it's not frightening. Meanwhile, if someone did not grow up with good well-being, they will grow up to be scared of these relationships. And this is again when you need friends, and you should establish mutuality with extended and diverse social groups. So intimacy here, it's not just marriage and romantic relationships, it's any close bond. So this stage is basically all about having those close, deep relationships with your friends as well, without you becoming too absorbed in them, without you attaching to them too much, and also without you being so scared from intimacy. And someone that fails to get over this stage, they're gonna be self-absorbed and isolated, and they're probably only gonna have super superficial friendships. Then we have stage 7, which is generativity versus stagnation. And at this stage, the adults, they ask themselves if they're contributing to the greater good of the world. خلاص, they're getting older. They feel like they have to contribute and to generate something that is going to leave their mark on the world. And this can be by raising children and benefiting them, or it can be by benefiting others and doing charity events or anything that boosts society. Like this old man planting roses and trees over here. So if someone didn't, develop a strong identity, you can't really expect them to expand beyond their own. They can't really generate anything for future generations when they don't know who they themselves are. So these people that without interests, without identities, they become self-involved and stagnant. واقفين ما عم يتحركوا. They become unable to accept the idea of death because they start feeling like, they have unfinished business. Then we have the final stage, which is integrity versus despair and isolation. Now, when people grow old, they will start reflecting on their lives. Despair is when you feel like you haven't done anything meaningful with your life. And obviously, the more goals you achieve, the more good you do in the world, and the better you will feel about the end of your life. Okay? So, isolation mainly happens here. Okay? Despair and isolation if someone is old. So, healthy children will not fear life if their parents have integrity enough not to fear that. Okay? So, everything was building up, and now you either reap the fruits of what you did previously, or خلاص, you don't have any past achievements. your life sucked before this, you're gonna be despairing over it. So now we're done with the personality lectures. Now we're gonna move on to the clinical assessment of patients with behavioral symptoms, and we're mainly discussing psychology and intelligence here. So there's honestly nothing much for me to comment on in this lecture. بس يعني we'll do what we can. Intelligence is a concept rather than intelligence is a concept, right? It's not يعني like your height. It's not wallah this person is 180 centimeters. It doesn't work like that. Intelligence is not an objectively real trait. It's something we measure. It's a concept, and if you treat it like an objective concrete trait, you commit an error called reification, which is when you view an abstract concept as a concrete thing. And we measure intelligence by IQ, and you've all heard about IQ tests. And if you score well on one sort of cognitive test, you have a tendency to score well on another because intelligence tends to feed itself. So if you're good at one thing, that's going to boost your chances of being good at the other thing. And intelligence is the ability to learn from experience, problem solve, use knowledge to adapt to new situations, and intelligence is what intelligence tests measure. Wow. So, is intelligence one general ability or several specific abilities? We currently know it's several specific abilities. However, when we first started out thinking about intelligence, Charles Furman said that there is one common G factor that underlies all intelligence behavior. You know, it's just one general intelligence and that's it. Because you're either intelligent or you're not. And this is obviously outdated. Then came Thurstone, who did this test where he gave 56 tests to people and he mathematically identified 7 clusters of primary mental abilities: word fluency, verbal comprehension, spatial ability, perceptual speed, numerical ability, inductive reasoning, and memory. Now, I want to pause here for a second. I know I just listed 7 things and you recalled none of them. However, you don't know where the SAQ is coming from. Our SAQ was from this lecture. And you don't really know if this can be your SAQ. فصح it seems like a bunch to memorize, but give it a try يعني basically. More importantly, we have Howard Gardner, who proposed the idea of 8 intelligence, and he basically found these 8 things, and he basically gave an exemplar for each of them. Someone that is really good at this specific area of intelligence. So we know how specific people are good at specific things. Like you have a friend that knows how to draw, and another that's just really smart and studying. This is because they might have different aptitudes. 8 intelligence. So there's the linguistic, which is communication, writing, verbal, like this poet called Eliot. And there is the logical mathematic kind of intelligence, which is exemplified by Einstein. There's the musical. Some people, they have a musical ear, like Stravinsky. There's the spatial, which includes art, so like Picasso. Bodily kinesthetic, which includes Graham, the dancer. And intrapersonal, so that is inside your own psychology, self-psychology. So that's Freud, who was a psychiatrist, we just talked about. Interpersonal, like Gandhi, so that's between people. And naturalist, like Darwin. So I know I just threw a bunch of words at you, but you can remember this by categorizing it. So there's the intelligence that we mainly see in schools. So that includes the linguistic and the logical. And then there's intelligence related to art. So we have musical, spatial, and bodily kinesthetic. Dancing, some people consider it an art. And then there is the psychological, or the between people. So interpersonal and intrapersonal. And then there's naturalist, which is environment. And Gardner said that mental abilities come in packages, and if someone receives brain damage, they might lose an ability, but they're not going to lose the rest. So for example, you take this in neuro as well. Someone has Broca's aphasia. They can't speak, however, they can still understand things. That left that ability intact. And he said there's what's known as savant syndrome. It's when people score low on everything, but they have one island of intelligence. So that's a savant. Then we have Robert Sternberg's 3 intelligences, and he talked about analytical, creative, and practical. So they're all, by the way, they're all beating around the same bush. They're all explaining the same thing, but they're just categorizing it differently. So Robert said it's 3 intelligences: analytical intelligence, which is problem solving and can be assessed by intelligence tests, and it predicts school grades reasonably. So that's your book smarts. There's creative intelligence, which is reacting adaptively to new situations and generating new ideas. And then there's practical intelligence, which is required for everyday tasks that aren't well defined and they have multiple solutions. And the way I memorize this is that you know how like they talk about book smarts and street smarts and social smarts. So that's sort of like it. So now let's talk about assessing intelligence. So to give you some background, we needed a way to assess intelligence back then when France first passed a law requiring all children to go to school, and the person that went through this was Alfred Binet. Alfred Binet overtook this mission and sought to measure intelligence by mental age. And I think we're all getting those ads on our phones where it's like, come and identify your mental age. And they believe that training children can make them smarter, mental orthopedics. And this is different than, you know, for example, some of the previous intelligence theories where they thought that خلاص, you're just born with intelligence and you live with it. No, Alfred Binet thought that you can make people smarter if they work hard on it. And then after Alfred came Lewis Terman, who took the Alfred Binet test. He studied at Stanford. He called it the Stanford Binet test. Then came William Stern, who would use this test to derive the intelligence quotient, or IQ, which we know. And he uses this by comparing your results to others of the same age. Now, this is a quick slide. So modern tests of mental abilities include those that assess personality and those that assess mental abilities more directly, which are divided into three. Again, three. So we have intelligence tests, aptitude tests, and achievement tests. Now, intelligence tests, they will measure general mental abilities to give a sense of intellectual potential. So this isn't about how much information you know. This isn't about if you're going to be good at something. It's just, are you intelligent or not? Like, do you have intellectual potential? Okay, so it's like going to be problem solving. Like, I guess you've seen those websites where it's like the squares and the triangles. That's an intelligence test. Then we have aptitude tests, which measures your ability to learn new skills, and they assess talent for specific types of learning. And one example of this, two examples actually, are the SAT and the Qudurat. So they measure your comprehension and your understanding of things, and that's basically them measuring your ability to learn new skills. Okay, and in other universities, they give you in other countries in school they give you an aptitude test, which basically tells you, like, for example, should you become a doctor, or should you become like a blacksmith or something, and that's aptitude tests. Then we have achievement tests, which will reflect what a person has already learned, and this is basically like our finals, or like the BHS final you're going to do. And we can also do psychological testing for all of these things. It's useful. It's not just for wallah criminals, and it's not just for fun. It's actually, for occupations, for education, for clinical settings. Someone with a psychiatric disturbance, psychological disturbance, you need to figure out how to manage them. And just go over this because it might come. And the definition of psychological testing is that, Zibda is that they are standardized and they are evidence-based. Okay? And, it is established conditions and established scoring rules. It's not subjective, it's not inferential, usually it's not inferential, it's always objective. And for example, like some tests, they give you like 20 minutes to solve a task. And some parents, they're gonna say that if you gave my child an hour, he would be able to solve it. Like, okay, he's gonna be able to solve it, but that's not the point of the test. The test is standardized in a way so that the average kid is going to be able to solve this task in 20 minutes. If you solve it in an hour, that means you're delayed. And most psychological tests are one of three. So again, as we said, someone performs a task, or there's observation of the subject's behavior within a particular context, and self-report measures. So on the second point, like let's say a kid is struggling in school, the psychologist might go to school with him and see what's happening. Self-report measures is when patients come to you and say, I am feeling this. And those are the three types of psychological testing. So it all really makes sense. We can use it for psychological diagnosis And psychological diagnosis is when we look for evidence that's going to lead to a diagnosis that's going to lead to treatment. So why is this? Because someone with a psychological disorder should receive interventions like therapy, counseling, and it's going to change their life basically. Psychological tests are instruments to make the psychological diagnosis. So if you're going to diagnose a patient, like someone comes with lupus or something, you diagnose using blood tests and labs and imaging and everything. Obviously, we don't have that for psychology, but we do have psychological tests. They're standardized, they collect information about human behavior, and there are specific criteria. Okay? And there are some issues with psychological testing, like ethics, culture, usefulness of tests, fairness. So if a school sends a child to get psychologically assessed, it becomes a question of who really owns the test. صح, the school sent him, but again, there's patient safety. The patient owns the test, actually. Now, the most widely used test for assessing intelligence is the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, known as the WAIS, developed by David Wechsler. There's a version for kids, the WISC, and another for preschoolers. And it's going to consist of 11 subtests, which will give you both an overall intelligence and then separate scores for each category. Why is this nice? Because it helps you pinpoint a learning difficulty. Let's say someone is good at everything, but on the verbal part, he's kind of weak. Maybe he has like a speech impediment, for example. So these are the 11 things that the Wechsler scale measures. And I added photos to make it easier. So vocabulary is obviously words. Similarities, so let's say I give you an orange and an apple and I ask you how they're similar. A normal person is going to say they're both fruits. Someone that might be psychotic is going to say that they're both circles. Arithmetics is basically math. Digit span is when you give someone a number and you ask them to memorize it. And so for example, if I give someone a number, like a sequence of numbers, so 351, and I ask them after 5 minutes to recall it, and they're able to recall it, then they scored well on this module. Then there's information like trivia and general facts. And there's comprehension, which is social comprehensions of like laws and rules and why there's social reasoning. Picture completion, someone should have like spatial awareness to complete a picture. Digit symbol coding, this is similar to algebra. Like we know how we say like x equals 5. So here like this symbol equals 1, this symbol equals 2, this symbol equals 3, and they basically try to like solve it. And block design, so you are given a pattern and you're giving these series of blocks with like triangles and shapes, and you have to copy the pattern. And picture arrangement, where you are given like for example 4 cards, and you're supposed to reconstruct the story with them, and you have to make sure that it's a logical sequence. مثلا a dog walks up to you, you pet the dog, you throw a ball, and then the dog takes it. This is like a normal answer. If someone will like jumbles it up, then they didn't score well. Symbol search, you're searching for a symbol out of many symbols, and you can really break down the Wechsler scale into the verbal components and the performance components. So again, this is super high yield, all of it. This is why I gave it special attention. So on verbal and performance tests on the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, this is basically everything we said. My mnemonic for this is verbal sadiq. So verbal is, you start with vocab and then sadiq, so SADIC, and then everything else is performance. However, if this comes like in MCQs, you're going to be able to answer it. If you're asked to list this, you should be able to, right? Without any external cues. Now on the Stanford Binet 4 test, it's composed of 4 parts, and صراحة my advice for you would just be to take a screenshot of this, keep reading it until exam day, until it sticks. And you have verbal reasoning, abstract visual reasoning, quantitative reasoning, and short-term memory. Verbal reasoning is going to include things that are verbal, so vocab, comprehension, absurdities, and verbal relations test. Abstract visual reasoning is, abstract and visual, so that's going to be patterns, copying, matrices, paper folding, and cutting test. Quantitative is all about numbers, for quantitative test. Number series test, equation building test, and then short-term memory, which is just memory for sentences, digits, and objects. And then, come on, just like the Wechsler, you have a composite, which is a total score, which is going to include all these areas. And now we're going to talk about the extremes of intelligence. And we know that most average people sit around here, and then you have the extremes on both sides. You have really smart people, and then you have people that are not really gifted. Starting with the low extreme, we give special care to these people because يعني هن they need support. Someone that's on the other end of the spectrum is not really going to need as much support. We know these people do. So this is why we categorize them, because we need them for placement. So someone with a severe intellectual disability is not going to be able to go through school. And some parents, they're not really aware that their child has this severe intellectual disability. They're going to have him repeat like first grade like 10 times. And this is just a waste of resources on the government, and it's a waste of time for the parents and the teachers and the kid himself. And he's just getting exposed to bullying, for example. So having a way to categorize intelligence is going to allow us to make better decisions, leading to better outcomes for people. So we have four main levels. We have mild intellectual disability, moderate intellectual disability, severe intellectual disability, and profound intellectual disability. And these are the IQ ranges of each. And mild, they can make it to like sixth grade. Moderate, second grade only. Severe, it gets like way harder. And then profound, they just require complete aid and supervision. Now, if you had someone with an IQ higher than this, you would not call it a learning disability. So someone with an IQ of 85, they're just a slow learner. They're not mildly disabled, mildly intellectually disabled. So the high extreme is the opposite. We call them whiz kids sometimes as well. Like John Piaget, he was a gifted kid. And the stability of testing is important here. The stability of test scores increases with age. So by age 4, the scores will fluctuate somewhat. However, at about age 7, scores become fairly stable and consistent. What does this mean? It means that if someone takes an intelligence test when they're young, their intelligence might change when they grow older. But the older they are, the more we can say confidently that, yeah, this is the intelligence they're going to have for a lifetime. And again, this is because someone can receive like a head injury or something, or they can go through school and learn better, and that's going to make them more intelligent. So now on assessing psychological disorders, again, a very busy slide. صراحة nothing much for me to add. بس إنه assessing psychology should be comprehensive. Don't just do a spot diagnosis. If someone comes to you with a psychological issue, follow through with them. Don't just say, "Yalla, take antidepressants and never see you again." Let's say someone came with a psychological problem. We ask ourselves, what is the issue here? What is the person doing? Why is the person doing this? We make it like very holistic. We focus on the here and now. So, as psychologists, you would not really care about the childhood that the person faced. We're not here to do psychoanalysis. We're here because this person has like an active behavioral problem that we need to fix now. So we focus on the here and now. We don't really care if your childhood looked bleak or if you had an absent mother. We ask what the current patterns are so that we can treat them. For example, do you get scared when it's exam season? Because that's something we can work on. That's a trigger that we can work on. And again, treat them like a person, not just like a case study. And then I guess the most important thing here is the ABC, which is the antecedent, behavior, and consequences, which you can see here. This is something we focus on in behavioral assessment. The antecedent is basically what leads up to the event. The behavior is the specific psychological behavior you do, and then the consequences are what happens after. So let's say you're a person with anger issues and your spouse asks you about work, and this is going to trigger you, so this is the antecedent. So you're going to crash out, that's the behavior, and then your spouse is going to be scared to talk to you in the future, that's a consequence. Okay? And again, we have observation as one method of assessment, and this can be by observing them in their natural habitat, basically. Go to the school where the kid is, and you can do this formally or informally with self-monitoring or others observing. And there's always a problem of someone acting differently just because they know they're being observed. So formally, you can use like validated scales. Tell them on a scale of 1 to 10, do interviews. Meanwhile, informally, an informal way to assess someone behaviorally is, let's say you're doing an interview and you see a person fidgeting with their hands a lot, or like their leg is jumping up and down. That's an informal way to notice that, oh, maybe this person is in some psychological distress. So On the domains of assessment, we have both objective psychological testing and projective tests. Okay, so objective psychological testing is basically your run-of-the-mill assessment where it's like a quiz and the patient has to solve it, like probably with the help of the psychologist or the psychiatrists. That's objective. Projective is when you show the patient something and you see what he projects on it. So one classic example is the ink blot test. So for example, you have a patient with psychosis. He comes to you, he's like, doctor, assess me. You show him this photo and you ask him what he sees. Now maybe a normal person here is going to see like two bears dancing or something else. This person might tell you, no, I see a person murdering someone else. Hello? So they're projecting what's inside of them onto the test, the testing instrument. And there is a high degree of inference in scoring and interpretation. So because it's not objective, yani it's not a set scale. There has to be inference in scoring and interpretation. And examples of projective tests include the Rorschach ink blot test and the thematic apperception test. We're going to cover these both more in a bit. Reliability and validity data tend to be mixed because they're not objective, they're not standardized really. So now let's talk about personality traits, and I'm sure yani, some of you will find this interesting. So this guy Alpert, he described fundamental traits that make up a person. And eventually we found like 1800 traits to describe people. And these psychologists, Ising, the two Isings actually, they believe that normal variations can be reduced to 2 or 3 dimensions made up of okay, so you have this dimension which is introverted, extroverted, and this dimension which is unstable and stable. And according to them, we all sit somewhere on this graph, right? So for example, someone that's like extroverted and unstable, they're going to be touchy, restless, aggressive, impulsive. You know, someone that's stable and introverted, they're just going to be calm. And I wanted to pay attention to this figure because they can bring questions from it, yes. So moving on, Ising's dimensions, like they got expanded by some other people. They talked about the big five factors. And they consider it the winning test and the personality lottery. Basically, there are these 5 factors that make up who we are as people. They are conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, openness, and extroversion. And the mnemonic for this is canoe. You know, the little boat you go on. And so let's describe each of these. And صراحة, this slide should be in red. I don't know why it's not in red, but it's really high yield. So conscientiousness refers to someone being organized and disciplined. You know, or someone that's like, are they careful or are they careless? Are they disciplined or are they impulsive? Agreeableness is about being soft-hearted or ruthless, trusting, suspicious, helpful, and cooperative. And you get the point. Neuroticism, openness, and extroversion. And you have to memorize the examples here as well. So how stable are these traits? They're quite stable, but yeah, they can change a bit with age, with environment, and they tend to be heritable. So if your parents are introverted, you're likely to be introverted. And they predict success. For example, conscientious people, they tend to be organized, they plan ahead, so they tend to do better. Objective tests are characterized by their high reliability and validity. We talked about the projective tests. Projective tests, you have to infer. So they're not reliable, they're not very valid. Objective tests, they're basically items you have to solve. This is why they're highly reliable and valid. And they're not ambiguous, they require minimal inference, basically the opposite. And tests here will include the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, which contains 549 true or false items, and it's characterized by extensive reliability. And again, we have objective intelligence tests, so not just personality tests. So this is an example of the MMPI, the Minnesota Personality Inventory. So basically you get like these questions and then you answer like true or false. And they actually have a website if you guys want to try it. And they have a way to figure out if someone is lying by like putting agreeable things. And yeah, more so on the projective psychology tests. That's just how the BHS slides were structured, if I had to copy the structure. So these projective tests, this should say projective tests, They use relatively unstructured, often ambiguous test stimuli. The basic assumption is that when confronted with a vague stimulus, that's going to reveal things about the person. The test stimuli themselves are standardized. So maybe this is a correction to what I said. The stimuli themselves, يعني the photos you're shown, they're standardized between people. However, the actual يعني inference and the projection is not standardized طبعا. So the Rorschach test is this test with the 10 ink blots, and you ask the patient what they see, you write it down, you move on. You can use it to assess psychosis, suicidality, depression, anxiety, and others. And the thematic apperception test, it's sort of similar to the story cards that we talked about. And you give them cards, you see what they do with the cards, what kind of story they make. Maybe someone that's happy will have a happy ending, someone that's sad is going to have like a sad ending. And the scoring is not standardized. Okay, this is an example of a projective test where the scoring is not standardized. There is nothing to say here صراحة. However, there are neuropsychological tests for the neurologists to do, so like neuroimaging, physiology, sleep studies, CT, MRI, PET. We have false positives and false negatives as some problems. Now we talk about the lecture of learning. So, learning is a behavioral change produced by repeated experiences of the situation, and learning happens by association. And conditioning is the process of learned associations. And we have two types of conditioning. We have classical conditioning and operant conditioning. So, for example, let's explain this. You heard that you learned هلا يعني أنت you learned that when you hear the adhan you go pray. So this is a behavioral change. This is one type of learning. It's a behavioral change because you experience this so much. Now, the behavior here isn't just physical behavior, it also includes recall. So, for example, if you learn a piece of information and you see an Anki card, the first time you do it, you're going to be slow. The second time, faster. The third time, faster. That's also a behavioral change that's basically in the form of recall that can happen with learning. And learning happens by association. So, for example, if I mention the word cinema right now, you're going to be thinking about popcorn because you associated the two things. And we really talk about classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Classical conditioning is more so two things happening simultaneously. Operant conditioning is something happens and then we see the consequence of it, and that is going to increase or decrease the habit. So classical conditioning, as we said, we learn to associate two stimuli and anticipate events. And this is like Pavlov's experiment where he would ring a bell and the dog would start salivating. So this is involuntary and it's also automatic. Operant conditioning is when we associate a response with its consequences, and this is really the gold mine of behavioral modification. So for example, if you're stressed and you smoke, psychologists can identify this pattern and they can be like, okay, you have to eliminate this stress and that's going to help you quit smoking. And observational learning is when we learn from others' experiences. So this is something that happens in your entire life, and that's why they say you're like the product of the person or the people you hang out the closest with, because you're going to become like them eventually. So let's talk about classical conditioning, and this entire slide is high yield. So in Pavlov's experiment, we start out with an unconditioned stimulus, which is food. حلو. By nature, food is an unconditioned stimulus that's going to cause an unconditioned response. So in nature, a dog is going to see food and he will start salivating. This is both unconditioned. No one had to teach the dog this. Then, again, before conditioning, we bring a whistle or a bell, and when we sound it, the dog doesn't do anything. Why? Because it's a neutral stimulus. We haven't done anything here yet. During conditioning, what we do is we show the dog the plate of food, and then also we sound the whistle. And there's salivation here, which is an unconditioned response to the food at this stage. However, there's acquisition or there's the initial learning of this association, the whistle and the food. Eventually, the dog can hear the sound of the whistle and start salivating. The whistle became a conditioned stimulus, and the salivation became a conditioned response. Why is this? Because originally, the dog would hear the whistle and wouldn't do anything. The whistle was just a neutral stimulus. And because this became a conditioned stimulus, this became a conditioned response. So the dog will start salivating upon hearing the whistle. And classical conditioning is all about turning this neutral stimulus into a conditioned stimulus. And this can happen to humans as well. So, for example, if you're scared of a dentist and you suddenly start hearing the drill they use, you're gonna start getting scared immediately. And there's five things that we talk about in classical conditioning. I already mentioned one, which is acquisition. Acquisition is the initial stage of learning, and it's the process by which a neutral stimulus starts to trigger a conditioned response. So, for example, there's the IPOF test, which is where you have a subject and you play a sound, and then you send like a puff of air into their eye. You play the sound, they close their eyes, right? Because there's a puff of air. Eventually, if you play the sound without giving the puff of air, they're going to close their eyes because they have basically learned this association. It's just an example that was in the slides, so I thought I would cover it, but it's really obvious. صراحة. Extinction is when the conditioned response weakens because you are not giving the stimulus enough. So basically, it's forgetting. Spontaneous recovery is if extinction happens and you give a break, then you give the conditioned stimulus again, you're going to see a conditioned response. So spontaneous recovery. You take a break and you remember. Generalization is the tendency to respond to similar stimuli, and this can be adaptive. So, for example, as we said in the example of the dog hears the bell and starts salivating. But then, if they also hear a tuning fork or a whistle, they're also going to start salivating. This is generalization. Discrimination is distinguishing between a conditioned stimulus and an irrelevant stimuli. So, for example, the dog would only respond to the whistle. He wouldn't respond to the bell or the tuning fork. And again, one way to memorize this is that these two are opposites, and these two are opposites, and then there's just spontaneous recovery. So, some applications of classical conditioning, we can use this to intervene with drug users. And there's this experiment of Little Albert. Now, Little Albert is this baby boy, and it's a very unethical experiment. Actually, the psychologist got his license removed for it. And Little Albert was shown a furry animal, like a rabbit, and anytime this furry animal came near him, the psychologist would play a really loud noise by striking metal with a hammer. So Albert eventually learned that whenever he would see a furry animal, there would be a scary noise. He would start crying. Eventually, even without playing a noise, Albert would just freak out whenever he would see the furry animal, the rabbit. So in this case, the white rabbit here actually, became a conditioned stimulus. Then we can talk about operant conditioning, which has to do with consequences. And this is more so the learning we talk about in real life. So organisms obviously are going to associate their actions with consequences. So if someone does something bad, they get punished for it. If someone does something good, they get rewarded for it. So these rewards are called reinforcers, and they make an action more frequent. And then if you want someone not to do something, you give them a punisher to do it less frequently. So reinforcers, which are rewards, they are either positive or negative. So we can have a positive reinforcer, which is basically giving someone a desirable stimulus. So let's say you get nice grades. Your parents are going to buy you like a Roblox gift card as a gift, for example. Or a reinforcer can be a negative reinforcer, where we remove an undesirable stimulus. So you get an A+, your parents say you don't have to wash the dishes for a week. And you hate doing the dishes, so you basically removed an undesirable stimulus. And both of these, one is called negative, both of these are reinforcers. They're going to increase the frequency by which you do this action, which is getting good grades. A punisher can also be positive or negative. So a positive punisher is bringing something that wasn't there before. However, in this case, it's an aversive stimulus. So you get a bad grade, your parents start yelling at you. Them yelling at you is an aversive stimulus. You don't want to hear it. And the negative punisher is removing a desirable stimulus. So you get a bad grade, your parents take away your Xbox. One example of a negative reinforcer is applying sunscreen. You apply sunscreen, you don't gain anything, but you prevent getting a sunburn. So that's one example of a negative reinforcer. Now we talk about the Skinner box and Skinner's experiments. Skinner was basically the guy that made the operant chamber called the Skinner box. And in this chamber, basically you have this animal and you have this lever. Now, whenever the animal would pull down on the lever, they would receive like candy or nuts or fruit. So they learned to push the lever more. They got rewarded for pushing the lever. And before that, there's something called shaping, which is obviously the rat doesn't know how to pull the lever down at the start. So what the instructors do is that they will reward the rat just for going close to the lever. This is basically teaching the rat that this is important, and you do this. They're rewarding the rat for coming near the lever. Eventually, the rat starts pushing down on the lever and getting reinforcements. Another way that the Skinner box operates is, for example, instead of giving candy, the liver can deliver an electrical shock. That's going to cause the rat to be scared of the liver and to avoid it. Um, so reinforcement schedules. So basically, the experiment, the Skinner, he did something in which sometimes he would give the rat a reward continuously, and sometimes he would give it intermittently. And that obviously caused different reactions from the rat. So we have continuous reinforcement, which is reinforcing the desired response every time it occurs, and then partial or intermittent reinforcement, which is when it's not always reinforced. So to talk about this more, and again, this slide is super high yield, partial reinforcement is either after doing the thing or after some time has passed. Okay, so let me explain. So fixed ratio is when you reinforce after a set number of responses. So what does this mean? In cafe shops like Dr. Cave, you every time you buy 5 coffees, you get 1 coffee for free. So every time you do something for a specific amount, for a specific frequency, like 5 times, you get reinforced. Then we have variable ratio, which is you do something but you don't know if you're going to get rewarded for it. So this is really what happens with slot machines and why it's so addicting, because you play it and you don't know if you're going to hit the jackpot after 1 time or 10 times or 100 times. You just keep playing it and hoping you're going to win, and that makes it super addicting. And it's also similar to Instagram reels. You keep scrolling through reels, you're not sure if you're going to get a nice reel or a bad reel, and you're just looking for a nice reel, but that's a variable ratio schedule. Now, interval refers to time. So a fixed interval schedule is that you do something and then after some time passes, you get rewarded for it. So this is, for example, salaries. You work for a month and you get paid on the first of the month, every time. Variable interval schedule, it's basically like you do something and you might get rewarded for it later, you might not. So the best example I can give for this is that you would keep checking your phone to see if you got a notification, right? It's not about checking your phone, it's about the fact that you don't know when you're going to get a notification. Another example of variable interval schedule is a random pop quiz. Okay? You never know when the pop quiz is coming, but you study for it, but you never know when it's coming. So, the pop quiz can reinforce your behavior to study more. So that's why in school they used to give us a bunch of pop quizzes, because it makes you study. You don't know when it's going to happen. And that's variable interval. Fixed interval can be, for example, a weekly quiz. Like, you know that every week on Thursday you have a quiz, so you're going to be studying for that. So obviously, punished behavior is suppressed. But it's not just the literal meaning. Let's say at home you're not allowed to drink diet soda. What happens is that when your parents catch you, they're gonna be yelling at you. Instead of quitting drinking soda, you're just gonna drink it outside. So this behavior is suppressed inside the house and it's let free outside the house. Punishment can teach discrimination, it can teach fear, and it may increase aggression. This is why don't just spank kids, actually teach them what they should do. So some applications, the doctor talks about sports, work, and how in our lives we can state a goal and then follow a checklist to make sure we're consistent with our goal, and reinforce it by taking breaks, by, for example, having candy every time you do 100 Anki cards, and then by reducing rewards gradually so that we learn discipline and start doing it just for the sake of learning, not for reward continuously. Now we talk about learning by observation, and obviously we learn by imitation and copying others. This is why role models are important. So, for example, as a kid, you might have seen, the nerdy kid in class get good grades, and then he shows up the next day with Roblox gift cards, right? That's gonna make you want to be like him. This is a positive role model. However, people can also have negative role models. All of this is about learning by observation. Now, science has also proved the existence of mirror neurons in the brain, which get activated when observing an action, and it leads to copying it. mirror neurons because they make you mirror the actions of someone in front of you. And some problems with observation is that this is why we need to limit violence on TV because we don't want kids copying it. One example of kids copying violence is the famous Bandura's Bobo doll experiment, where basically there's this Bobo doll, and kids are taken to a room where they see an adult interacting with the Bobo doll. Some adults will be hitting Bobo, and other adults will not be hitting Bobo. When it's the kids' turn, the kids that saw the adults hit Bobo are more likely to hit the doll. Meanwhile, the kids that didn't see the adult hit it, they're just not going to hit it. This shows that aggression can be learned, and this is why learning by observation. So that's the learning lecture. It was really light. Now onto the intellectual disabilities. So intellectual disabilities are defined as significant limitations in intellectual functioning and adaptive behaviors, which includes these three domains: conceptual, social, and practical. And importantly, it originates prior to age 18. So you wouldn't call Alzheimer's an intellectual disability because it develops after age 60. Meanwhile, like things that happen before 18, they are intellectual disabilities. You mainly have three domains or three skills that we assess in intellectual disability. The important thing is that we don't really go by IQ level anymore. We go by these skills because these skills tell you more if a person needs help or not. And do they need support? Can they live alone? This is what these skills tell you. We have conceptual skills like language, reading, writing, math, knowledge, reasoning, and memory. We have social skills, so for example, empathy, social skills, judgment, interpersonal communication, ability to follow rules and make friendships. Practical skills like personal care, job responsibilities, money management, recreation, organizing school, organization, school, and other tasks. But these are the three domains that you really assess in each person that comes with an intellectual disability because it tells you what you need to do for them, what interventions need to be done. You're going to see كمان how different levels of intellectual disability, the ones we talked about, mild, moderate, severe, profound, they have different levels of these. So this is just an introduction. I don't think it's important, but still read it. And then we know that each level of intellectual disability requires different support, and this is super high yield. As we said, we don't care about IQ, but we still have to memorize it. People with intermittent support, they tend to be mild intellectual disability or mental retardation, but we don't say that anymore. So intermittent support is, these are higher functioning individuals. They can live fine, they can take care of themselves, but they require intervention to function during times of stress. These are intermittent support, you give them support intermittently, and they have a mild intellectual disability only. Limited support is for individuals who require additional support to navigate through everyday situations. It's like moderate mental retardation. Extensive support is for individuals who rely on around-the-clock support to function, which is for severe mental retardation. Pervasive support, these have profound mental retardation. They need help in حرفيا everything. Daily intervention. And okay, so I have added the PDFs. You can see how the PDFs are very, full of information. But this is a nice summary of each. So for mild, which is the intermediate support, they're going to have some difficulties in learning academic skills involving reading, writing, arithmetic, time, or money. They're not really going to make it past the 6th grade. They have impaired abstract thinking, executive function, short-term memory, functional use of academic skills. That's for the conceptual domain, which is all about thinking. For the social domain, they're going to be immature in their social interactions. They're going to say jokes that feel immature. They're going to be concrete or immature in their language. So, for example, they're not really going to use abstract thought. They're not going to say, strong vocab. They're going to be very simple in how they sound. They're going to have difficulties regulating emotion and behavior. So they might throw temper tantrums. And they have a limited understanding of risk in social situations, and they're at risk of being manipulated. They're gullible. They don't know that some people, they don't deserve trust. For the practical domain, they may function at an age-appropriate level, but they may need support with complex tasks. And if they can dress themselves, they can feed themselves, but they can't really get a job as an engineer, for example. They can get jobs that don't really emphasize conceptual skills. And for example, they can be bagging groceries in a supermarket. And support is only required for abstract concepts. And basically, these are the intermediate support. They are your average person, but they're just slightly impaired all over. They don't really understand sarcasm. They don't understand social cues. Um, they can't really deal with money management because you need a higher level of intellect for budgeting. Um, and however, they still have hobbies. They still have recreational events. But they need help with like health management or legal decisions. And the most ideal thing here is this last sentence, whereas there is a somewhat concrete approach to problems and solutions compared with age mates. This is in the conceptual domain. They just tend to be more concrete. For the moderate severity level, these kids will struggle with preschool because they have a hard time learning to read and do basic addition. They have a much harder time socially, and they have maladaptive behavior. Maladaptive behavior starts here. The more aggressive a maladaptive behavior is, the more common it is to be with worse intellectual disability. Yani these people they have moderate severity level or limited support, and their maladaptive behavior can basically just be, socially harmful. So they're going to be picking their noses when talking to people, for example. And this is high yield. They need extended teaching and time to become independent. Now compare that to the people with the severe severity or people who require extensive support. Their maladaptive behavior tends to be more aggressive, including self-injury, so they might be biting themselves or cutting off their own nails. And these people, they speak single sentences, حتى single words. So maybe they will say food, water. They might say very basic sentences, I hungry. They might not have the complexity of relationships that normal intellect people might have. However, they still enjoy being around their family and their familiar loved ones. And yep, you guys can just go over the rest. For profound severity level, this is the most difficult people to help. They are just very physical, very concrete. Their language is very limited. They tend to be non-verbal, so they point at the things they want rather than actually say stuff. They're completely dependent. They can do the most simple of actions, not much more than that. However, they can still enjoy music, walks, water activities, but obviously they need support with that. This is the PDF. Now, the differential diagnosis of intellectual disability is important to keep in mind because you don't want to accidentally diagnose someone with an intellectual disability. They just have autism, for example. So we know that we have specific learning disorders, which is not an intellectual disability. Someone with dyslexia might be of normal intelligence, but they just can't really read. And these numbers are high yield. So the autism spectrum disorder, these individuals tend to also have intellectual disability. Comorbidity rates used to be like 70 to 75, but now we know that they're closer to 40 to 55. They're never going to bring these two choices in the same question, but you should know both of them. So for their assessment, you need to use a test that makes sense to them. You can't really use the tests, like for example, the Wishler Adult Intelligence Scale. It's you can't really give it to someone with a severe or profound intellectual disability because they have verbal instructions. Meanwhile, these people, they're often mostly non-verbal. And the tests we use for the intelligence tests, they tend to have rigid administration and scoring procedures. So, I remember for my batch, and I think for all batches, the doctor asked us to focus only on these three and ignore the rest. You have to know the name and the age range, and just get an idea of the strength and the limitations. So we said we have the Stanford Binet Intelligence Scale, which is for adults. It's from 2 years to 85 years. And it's really standardized, reliable, and valid. And we have the Wishler Preschool and Primary Scale of Intelligence, which is for preschool. So it's from 2 years, 6 months to 7 years, 3 months. And it's good for kids. And the Wishler Intelligence Scale for children, from 6 years to 16 years and 11 months. And it's also standardized and reliable. For toddlers, we have the Bailey scale, which we talked about in the first crash course. And this one is for infant and toddler development. It's from 1 year to 3 years and 6 months. However, it does not assess future IQ. If you remember, we talked about that. And you don't have to know this. From here, for adaptive functioning, we have two scales called the Vineland. And the Vineland is really widely used. There's a parent form, which is a caretaker form, and there's a teacher form. And it's basically like an interview with the parent or the teacher. They ask about things regarding adaptive functioning, like if the kid can tie their shoelaces, feed themselves, and then the parent is going to say yes or no. It's an assessment of how the parent looks at the child rather than really looking at the child doing anything at all. And as a psychologist, you're not looking at the kid, the parent is looking at the kid. And the one for caregivers is from a younger age, so it's from 0 years to 18 years, 11 months. Meanwhile, the one for teachers is older because you don't expect kids to be at school at 1 year old. It's from 3 years to 21 years, 11 months. Now, as a psychologist, you should not tell the parent that their kids are only a little delayed and that he's going to catch up. If someone has an intellectual disability and they actually need support and help, you can't lie to the parents. And this initial experience should be very important. You don't want to instill false hope, but you also don't want to scare them away from reaching out for resources and for help. And give a written report. And try to gauge the expectations of the parents, because if they expect their kid to be a doctor, but their kid can only achieve a 6th grade level of intellect, that's obviously a problem. Now, about intellectual disability, it's very common. 30% more males are diagnosed with intellectual disability. So males tend to have higher prevalence of intellectual disability. However, the more severe intellectual disability is, the more likely it is for both males and females to have it. Risk factors include these, and just give them a read, صراحة. And about the risk factors, we know that genetic differences are the most important risk factor for intellectual disability. And these are the inborn errors of metabolism. They form 40 to 50% of cases. And I need you guys to memorize the percentages here. So the most common is the genetic differences. And then we have environmental exposure to toxins during pregnancy and perinatal complications, acquired medical conditions. You have to know all of these. And she also mentions that one common trap in exam questions is that if you suspect a kid has a genetic issue, you don't do this yourself as the psychologist. You just refer them to a geneticist and they're going to diagnose the issue. Oh, and the most common cause is congenital syndromes. The most common cause of intellectual disability is congenital syndromes. And obviously that's going to include inborn errors of metabolism. I'm not going to go through this. Congenital syndromes and neurobehavioral phenotypes. So this is more clinical, it's more fun. Here we have a syndrome called the 16p11.2 deletion syndrome. It's one of the newly defined copy number variants. This is the prevalence. I'm not sure, صراحة, if you have to memorize the prevalence. I don't think it's really high yield, but you never know what to expect. So these individuals have mild intellectual disability, frequent psychiatric comorbidities, and obesity. Now, let's pause here. Copy number variants, you might remember from genetics, is that it's basically like the sequence that can be amplified or it can be decreased. When you play around with this copy number variant, 16p11.2, you can get this syndrome. Sometimes it's a deletion. So for example, if you see this kid, he has a deletion in this copy number variant, and thus he has mild intellectual disability, and he has a triangular face and a bulbous nose. Meanwhile, this kid, he only has an amplification. He presents كمان with similar symptoms. You can see a triangular face, and he probably also has mild intellectual disability. The point here is it can be an amplification or a deletion. Now we're going to talk about DiGeorge syndrome, also known as 22q11.2 deletion, also known as vilocardiofacial syndrome, also known as Sprint-Zinn syndrome. So I want you to focus here on the fact that it's the most common survivable interstitial deletion in humans. It is associated with schizophrenia, ADHD, autism. It's associated with defects in neural crest development, right? And they have abnormalities with their T cells, their thymus, congenital cardiac abnormalities. They have mild intellectual disability, but they tend to score better. They tend to score better on the verbal part rather than the non-verbal part. And they have speech difficulties because of these craniofacial defects. Now, if you remember from Immuno, we talked about DiGeorge syndrome as these athymic mice, the hairless mice. Remember that they have problems with their thymus, and that's also going to point you towards a neural crest development. And you can notice how they have absent epicanthal folds, they have different epicanthal folds than normal people do, and they have an absent philtrum, which is the space over your lips. And they have a low nasal bridge, And yeah, that's it for the DiGeorge syndrome. And keep in mind that the doctor is probably not going to give you case scenarios to ask about. Yani you will not be asked to give a diagnosis. However, you might be asked like which condition is associated with, for example, here, which one is associated with neural cause development? You would say DiGeorge. Then we have Angelman syndrome. So Angelman syndrome is basically all about happy babies with hand flapping, and that's super diagnostic for Angelman. And the way I memorize Angelman is that it has like man in the name. It's because there's only the paternal allele. The maternal allele is deleted. So there's only the paternal allele. And they're characterized by gait ataxia, inappropriate frequent laughter, widely spaced teeth, and they have altered dopaminergic metabolism. And this is important clinically because if you're going to give them antipsychotics, you have to use caution. And Kaman, it's more important to focus on the pathognomonic features rather than, for example, a small head, because most mental disabilities, they do have small heads. And you just focus on the points of distinction. Then you have Prader-Willi syndrome, which is the opposite of Angelman. Prader-Willi, I remember it with W for women. So there is persistence of the maternal allele, and there is deletion of the paternal allele. Okay, and it's really important to keep in mind the triad of hyperphagia, obesity, and short stature, and they have compulsive food seeking and hoarding. And you just think about it, this is going to lead to the obesity that they have. And the intellectual disability in Angelman tends to be more severe than Prader-Willi, and this is a table for comparison. And Down syndrome, we are very familiar with this. It's trisomy 21. The phenotype is characterized by more than 80 features. They have a mild intellectual disability, mild to moderate even, and they have strengths in visual processing, but they have significant language impairments. They have strong social skills. They might have ADHD, aggression, and they tend to have early onset Alzheimer's, and it's only mild to moderate. And then we have fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, and this is what happens when the mother takes alcohol when she is pregnant with the baby. They have a very distinct facial appearance, and intellectual disability is a hallmark of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and the findings, they're sort of all related to alcohol, and حتى in adults. For the way I memorize this is I think about what chronic alcohol abuse does to someone. So alcoholics end up with ataxia. So that's why these children are going to have small cerebellums. They're going to have smaller brains. They're going to have inabilities to talk clearly. They can't focus. Just the same way that someone would act if they were actually intoxicated. Then we have Fragile X-related syndrome, and this is basically an expansion of an allele on the X chromosome. And you know how in each generation you can have more expansions of a certain allele. You can have parents that have Fragile X-associated tremor or ataxia syndrome, which will present as late onset progressive cerebellar ataxia and tremor. And in females, it can be primary ovarian insufficiency. What does this mean? The parents can have symptoms that come before Fragile X syndrome because they have an expansion, but the expansion is not long enough to cause Fragile X syndrome. For their kids are going to have full-on Fragile X syndrome. The parents, they have these other features, these Fragile X associated syndromes. It's the leading cause of intellectual disability. They sometimes have autism, and they tend to have ADHD as well. And it affects males more than females because it's X-linked, and that's something I wanted to remember. Fragile X-linked. And they tend to have very prominent ears. So finally, we have the MECP2 related disorders, which is Rett syndrome. And this is interesting because of their presentation. They develop normally, and then they regress. They have a regressive presentation. So they're going to develop normally, then they're going to lose all of that development. So they return to an earlier stage, and that's how I memorize it. Rett for return to an earlier stage of development. They have pathognomonic hand-wringing movements, and the mutation in males is often lethal. So you really only see this in females, and it causes severe intellectual disability. And they develop normally for the first 16 to 18 months. and they have prolonged QT. Why do we care about them having prolonged QT? Because most patients with like intellectual disabilities, we said they might have aggression. You're going to be giving them antipsychotics. Antipsychotics cause prolonged QT. If you give a patient with like Rett syndrome a drug that further prolongs QT, you might give them heart block. And we can go over this. And comorbid psychopathology, they tend to have comorbidity. Emotional and behavioral problems are more common in intellectually disabled children, of course, yani. And this can be because of severity of the disability, lower adaptive functioning, language impairment, lower socioeconomic status, and families with only one biological parent in the home. Prevention can be through all of these things, and psychotherapeutic approaches and behavioral approaches. The treatment, she never asks about these صراحة, but still it's important to know. Start low and go slow. You can give them antipsychotics, risperidone, antidepressants, anticonvulsants, adrenergics, psychostimulants, opioid antagonists, and enroll them in community programs. As a summary, the term intellectual disability has replaced mental retardation. We know the etiology of some of them. They develop the same as children, but at a different rate. They miss their milestones, but they eventually reach them, inshallah. The clinical evaluation includes all of these, and they tend to have comorbid psychopathology. Treatment is integrative. Behavioral interventions and psychopharmacological approaches have the best evidence base. So now to talk about emotions, and we have one more lecture after this and we're done. So why do we care about emotions? Because feelings, they add color to life. And humans, more than any other creature, will experience fear, anger, joy, and love. And anxiety can also present with somatic symptoms, so this is important for your medical practice. So emotions tend to be a mix of physiological arousal, expressive behaviors, and then the consciously experienced thoughts and feelings. So the question becomes, does cognition precede emotion? And let me give you an example here to explain it. Let's say you're driving, and we all know how the traffic in Riyadh is. So someone cuts you off, and you get angry. So let's define this anger. We can really break it down into what the body feels. So when you're angry, your heart starts racing. Expressive behaviors, thinking you're going to start honking aggressively. And then consciously experience thoughts and feelings, which is the mental awareness that you're angry. And come on, remember when we said that self-consciousness happens in the second year? Like the third year, I'm not sure. So this is the conscious experience of the feeling, but that's also an important part. So, we said that someone cut you off while you were driving. أنت you react by swerving without even realizing at first, and you just feel shaken and upset for the rest of the day. So the question here becomes, does cognition precede emotion? Because on one hand, you swerved, your body reacted, and then you were aware that you were angry. Or is it that they happen at the same time, or is it that we need cognition to interpret emotion? This is what these three theories aimed to achieve. So there's the James-Lange theory, the Cannon-Barth theory, and the Shasher and Singer two-factor theory. The James-Lange theory states that every emotion has a distinct physiological response, which is an arousal, and that's what's going to cause the emotion. So James-Lange says you feel like your heart starts beating, adrenaline starts pumping, and then you feel angry. Okay? And Cannon-Barth says that they co-occur, and that's a mnemonic I use. So he says that there's a distinct physiological response, which is the arousal, plus the emotion that they will co-occur simultaneously. So Cannon-Barth, they saw a problem with the James-Lange theory. They said that if you're scared or exercising on a roller coaster, you're going to have a racing heart regardless. Physiologically, it's not specific. And so you need the physiology and awareness, emotion at the same time in order to have like a comprehensive emotional state. It's not that your heart starts beating and then you feel afraid, it's that your heart starts beating and you feel afraid both at the same time. They coexist. Your takeaway from this is that they coexist, co-occur. Shasher and Singer go one step further than Cannon-Barth and say that you take the physiological response and you add a cognitive label, and then that is going to translate into an emotion. So let's say your heart is beating fast and there's a tiger in front of you. Your brain is going to come and it's going to apply a cognitive label. It's going to say, oh, danger, fear. So that's the emotion now. So if this is confusing for you, I have an explanation in the notes if you would like. And again, this is everything in words. Red means high yield. So for emotions, um, even though they might present in the same way, like a racing heart can be a product of just about anything, they have different circuits in the brain, and that's important because obviously, yani, you can tell the difference between when you're scared versus when you're excited, and you have to know the brain regions where you feel emotion. So disgust happens in the right prefrontal cortex. Depressed people have more right frontal activity. Positive mood is on the left, and emotions basically come from different parts of the brain. So our cognition is going to play an important role in how we feel emotion. And so if you're already hyped up for something and then you get provoked, you're going to have a stronger reaction than if you weren't hyped up in the first place. So let's explain this. Yani, we must have all experienced this when you're having a bad day and it's just like the worst day, and then your shirt gets stuck on the door and you crash out. Meanwhile, if this happened on a normal day, you wouldn't care, you wouldn't think twice. This tells you that emotions and arousal, they can spill over into each other. And this is why if someone is angry, like just don't add into it, don't rage with someone that's already angry. And arousal fuels emotion while cognition channels it. And while emotion requires cognitive awareness to be interpreted, emotions can linger after cognitive awareness shifts. So, let's say you're in the middle of a conversation and you realize you forgot a super important deadline. خلاص, you failed. And you feel upset, but you're in a conversation, so you're going to carry on with the conversation. And basically, your attention خلاص, is now with the conversation and you forgot about the actual deadline. The conversation is going to end and you're going to feel upset without really knowing why. Right? Does that make sense? So another way this can happen is that you might have an argument with someone that is important to you, and then you're just going to feel bad the entire day, even if you don't really recall the argument. Like, it's basically that emotions linger even if you're not really fixating on the event that actually happened. And we've all seen those ads where like they add a happy face to make you buy like their new soda or something, or like on smoking on cigarette packets, cigarette packs, they add scary photos to scare you off. This basically tells you that emotions are super important come in your decisions, and the amygdala sends more to the prefrontal cortex than it receives. It hijacks our thinking more, and cognition does not always precede emotion. So sometimes an event is going to happen and it's going immediately to lead to an emotional response, even without going through appraisal. Okay? Even without conscious awareness. So as we said, like a car in front of you like cuts you off, you immediately swerve and you get angry without even like appraising it, without even realizing why. And we know that humans, subhanAllah, we're experts at reading emotions. We're very social beings. And we understand both verbal and non-verbal. And to the extent that if I talk in a different language, but I sound angry, you're going to be able to tell that I'm angry. And humans are especially good at detecting threat. And experience will sensitize us to a particular emotion. So people with PTSD tend to be hypervigilant, and that's why like some anxious people, they might overthink stuff, like read too much into things, because maybe past experience has taught them that they need to be more careful in the future. Now the eyes and mouth are most telling of emotion, obviously. Fear and anger are most direct from the eyes, while happiness is from the mouth. And you guys know the difference between verbal and non-verbal. Like non-verbal, like someone is sitting with their arms crossed, not making eye contact with you. That's obviously different from someone who is talking to you face on. Now, emotions are not a flawless system, and there's a bunch of like false positives and false negatives. And sometimes it's still hard to read facial expressions. Some people are more sensitive to facial cues, and these tend to be introverted. It might be an explanation to why they're introverted, and it might be an explanation to why extroverts are so social, because they can't tell that people don't want them there. And gestures, tones, and facial expressions are all absent in digital communication, and that's why they're prone to misinterpretation. And speaking about females, they tend to read nonverbal emotional cues more often, and they have greater emotional literacy and more responsiveness in both positive and negative situations. They're just more emotionally capable than men are. And women, they tend to describe themselves as empathetic more so than men do. And they experience emotional events more deeply and recall them better. Why? Because it played a bigger role in their brain. Now, anger is often seen as a masculine emotion. And if you take a gender neutral face and you have AI apply like um, an angry expression on it, people are going to assume it's male, even though it's gender neutral. So hand gestures, they're not entirely universal. You know, this in Italy is just talking. Meanwhile, this where we're from means you're just wait until we get home. And however, some expressions they're universal, like facial expressions, like blind babies. They can still smile like we do. No, they have never seen a smile. No one has taught them how to smile, but they still smile. So this tells you it's universal. A smile is smile, whatever it is. And you know the context is important. Different cultures vary. We've talked about this in the previous crash course. And basically, you can trick yourself into feeling happy by looking happy. So if you go through the external motions of an emotion, it's going to actually affect your internal feeling as well. So all of these go into making emotions. We have biological influences, so physiological arousal, brain pathways, sociocultural influences like expressiveness, presence of others, cultural expectations, psychological influences, cognitive labeling, and gender differences. So, for example, like let's just explain this so you have more information to be able to recall the idea better. For example, a culture isn't expressive, so people are not going to show emotion as much. Presence of others, if you receive لا سمح الله, if you receive bad news in front of someone close to you, you can let go, you can break down عادي. But if you receive bad news in front of a class full of people, you're not going to express your emotions as freely. Cultural expectations, again, we've talked about this. Cognitive labeling and gender differences. Cognitive labeling, if someone is more mature cognitively, they may not react to every small thing. Gender differences, we said that females are more emotionally literate than men, than males. And biological influences, we have physiological arousal and brain pathways. If you are already hyped up, you are more likely to have a stronger reaction. And this should remind you of the biopsychosocial approach. So the basic emotions are present in infancy, and we've talked about this. Other emotions can be a combination of this, like love is a mixture of joy and excitement. And it's not only physiology and expressive behavior, it's also conscious experience. We've talked about all of this. Now, fear can be contagious or poisonous. And originally, it's an adaptive alarm system, and it prepares us to run and protects us from harm. And you have all these other things, صراحة. And fear can be taught. So originally, we're only really scared of like loud noises when we're young. However, we can learn other fears as we grow older. So, for example, if a kid has a mother that has a phobia from like roaches or insects, okay, whenever she sees a roach at home, she's going to freak out. The baby is going to learn this as well. So this is learning fear by association. And infants learn to fear falls and near falls when learning to walk. And as we said, fear is contagious. If you run into a room screaming, everyone is going to run away with you screaming as well, even if they don't understand what's going on. And some fears are more natural, and some are less natural. So, for example, humans tend to learn fears from snakes and cliffs easier than they learn car collisions as like a fear. And the amygdala plays a key role in associating emotions, including fear. And they did this experiment where they would, scare people by playing a scary sound, but they would play the color blue before it. Eventually, come on, this is like an example of conditioning, classical conditioning. People would see the color blue eventually and get scared. We took these people, we took out their amygdalas, and we showed them the color blue. They were able to remember that, oh, this is something that should be scary, but they didn't feel fear. So that tells you the importance of the amygdala. If we take out their hippocampus instead, they're going to be scared, but they're not going to recall why. Once again. So, again, about fear. Some people have, they're adrenaline junkies. Some people have phobias. Phobias A phobia is a fear outside of the normal range, and this is going to interfere with the ability to cope. And it does have a genetic side to it. Researchers found a gene responsible for serotonin reuptake in the amygdala. If you have a shorter version of this, there's going to be more serotonin in the amygdala, meaning there's going to be a stronger fear response. Talking about anger, anger is sometimes more painful than the injury it causes. So if you upset your parent, you're going to feel worse because you angered them, not because they punished you. فسometimes يعني anger itself is more painful. And anger can be a response to small annoyances like foul odors, high temperatures. Anger can be harmful, and chronic anger is related to heart disease because when you're angry, you have a physiological response, your blood pressure increases, but that's going to cause heart disease eventually. Now, how do people deal with anger? And this is important for us. Boys reported that they walk away from anger or they work it off with exercise. Meanwhile, girls, they tend to talk it through with friends or listen to music. We have pop culture teaches us some stuff. Like for example, oh, if you're angry, you should vent. If you're angry, you should go cathart. فventing about your anger هو أصلا in most societies it's seen as a threat to group harmony. Even though some other cultures they say it's good to vent your anger. However, venting your anger in this way is called like catharsis, when you're letting out all of the anger and you're letting it out on, for example, a pillow or a punching bag. That's catharsis. You're just screaming your heart out. And catharsis tends to not really cleanse your rage. And catharsis and venting, both of them, they might increase your aggression actually. Or, they don't really do anything for your anger. They just teach you more violence. They teach you more aggression. And venting, if you're venting about something and not solving it, you're replaying it in your mind over and over and over again. And you're retraining the loop of remembering the thing that upset you and getting upset about it. And you're just getting angrier. Anger can become maladaptive when it fuels verbally or physically aggressive acts that we later regret. And sometimes anger is healthy and righteousness, but other times it's maladaptive. So if we can't vent or cathart, how should we deal with anger? We either wait it out, or we deal with it in a way that doesn't feed into this loop that I just talked about. So for example, instead of venting, talk it through with a friend. Have them walk you through it. Okay. Don't ruminate. Rumination is when you keep thinking about something. That's going to make it worse, as we said. And anger can have a pro-social effect. So it's going to communicate strength and competence in some societies, Like they want their leader to be a strong, angry, masculine man. They believe that anger is going to increase that. Anger can benefit a relationship when it expresses the problem in a way that can promote conflict resolution. So this is if you communicate your anger with words and thoughts rather than yelling and crashing out. Now, happiness. Happiness is a goal for most. We all want to be happy, inshallah. And inshallah, you're going to be happy with your BHS grades. Your mood will color your thinking, and happy people perceive the world as a safer place, feel more confident, make decisions more easily, live healthier, more satisfied lives. Yani if you had to choose something, choose to be happy. Happy people tend to help others more. But when you help someone, you become happier. So because you're happier, you also help them more. Does that make sense? So it becomes like the cycle, the do good, feel good phenomenon. And the emotional ups and downs of daily life, we all have emotional ups and downs every day, and these gloomy moods tend to go away after sleeping them over, and the next day is always usually better. And positive emotions rise over the early to middle parts of most days. This is high yield. It should be in red. We tend to overestimate the duration of our emotions and to underestimate our capacity to adapt. So this is why كمان they say إنه لما ينزل البلاء بينزل مع اللطف. Like when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tests you with something difficult, He also brings with it mercy. We overestimate the duration of our emotions, the duration of our hardship, but we underestimate our capacity to adapt. So talking about money makes you happy to a point. And however, if you make money your goal in life, you're not going to be as happy as someone that makes happiness his goal in life. And about adaptation and comparison, let's say you get a promotion and you start making more money. At first, you're going to feel ecstatic about that. You're going to feel really happy, but then you're going to adapt to this and it's going to become your new norm. This is your baseline now. You need a bigger hit to feel happy. Does that make sense? And this is also where comparison is important, because if you keep comparing yourself with people that are above you, you're not going to feel good. So you should always try to compare yourself with people that are less fortunate than you. And anyway, we see this in Islam a lot, صراحة. The entire concept of rida and acceptance. And these are just some predictors of happiness. You know, you're more likely to be happy if you have high self-esteem, you're optimistic, outgoing, agreeable, you have a satisfying marriage or close friendships, you have work and leisure that engage your skills, have a meaningful religious faith, sleep well and exercise. However, happiness is not related to age, gender, parenthood, or physical attractiveness. Studies of emotions remind us of these things. And now we talk about the last lecture, which is aggression and violence. So aggressive behavior is violent actions towards other. It's intent to harm or injure another person. It's instinctive in animals, but it's learned in humans. Yani, think of it as us being born naturally good. And this is just the most high yield part of the entire lecture. I really want you to focus on this slide. So it's basically, you know, aggression is a scale between your impulse and your control. So impulse can be increased by conflicts in the environment. So someone hypes you up, someone, you know, rage baits you. It can be increased by organic or neurological impairments, such as traumatic brain injury or cognitive impairment. So these are like mental disorders that will cause you to have a stronger impulse that healthy people might not otherwise have. For example, schizophrenia maybe. Control can be decreased by intrapsychic fragility, and someone who has poor psychological resilience and they can't really regulate their anger. Or someone that is going through a grief period, for example. Now, for chemical disinhibition, it's because, for example, alcohol doesn't allow you to differentiate right from wrong and you lose control. You have to memorize the examples of each, and this slide again is just super high yield. The best predictor of violent acts is a previous violent act, and these are other predictors, and these are conditions that are associated with violence and aggression. So we tend to underestimate violence in girls. It's actually 49% of girls will show aggression, and aggression in girls tends to be later onset and relational in nature. And again, you have to differentiate between, you know, simple teenagers being angry and like actual, you know, lifelong anger. So life course persistent aggression, often they have a childhood onset of conduct disorder, they have many adverse family risk factors, all of these stuff. They're a smaller percentage of the population, but they commit most of the crimes. And it's kind of sad صراحة because they get ingrained into the criminal system and they just stay there. They become frequent flyers of the justice system, basically. As we said, anger or aggression can be pro-social, which is male dominant, stereotypical, influenced by testosterone, or it can be impulsive, which is related to decreased serotonin. And this is because of decreased synthesis, release, or depletion of stores, or destruction of serotonergic neurons. CSF levels of 5-HIAA are inversely correlated to aggression in both males and females. And if they're high, there's going to be low aggression. And if 5-HIAA is low, there's going to be high aggression in both males and females. Know the difference between impulsive and prosocial. Now, you're not really going to do neuroimaging studies for these patients. They're more so for research. However, you only do neuroimaging if someone comes to you with like very sudden onset aggression, because that maybe tells you they have a brain tumor or an anterior venous malformation. And you can just read this over here. And then aggression tends to run in families, and there's a higher concordance for aggression among monozygotic twins. This tells you it can be genetic. Environmental factors play a big role, especially poverty, low socioeconomic status, harsh parenting, poor supervision, and parental psychopathology. So some social factors on aggression, we can see frustration, the hypothesis that this leads to aggression, particularly with intense, direct provocation, someone basically rage baits you, physical abuse elicits aggression, بس here it's يعني physical abuse, exposure to televised violence, environmental causes can annoy you, like bad smells, air pollution, noise, situational heightened physiological arousal, or physical pain. Aggression, prevention and control of aggression can be through the following, depending on the level of aggression: punishment, social skills training, induction of incompatible responses. Yani you're basically teaching someone that someone says something that ticks you off, instead of going and fighting this person, just laugh it off. Just humor, empathy. drug treatment if it's really bad. For the final part, which is neglect and abuse, it can happen to both genders, of all socioeconomic backgrounds, of all ethnic groups, and it's obviously going to predispose to psychiatric disturbances. Children who have been sexually abused have increased frequency of poor self-esteem, depression, dissociative disorders, and substance abuse. Abusive parents are often victims of abuse themselves, فيعني they continue the cycle of abuse. And social isolation, parents with mental disorders, children with intellectual disability, prematurity, physical disabilities, they're all risk factors between the parent-child bond that can lead to child abuse. Physical abuse is often by the mom, while sexual abuse is often by men. Diagnosis of abuse, physical, just look at unusual injuries or injuries that take the shape of an instrument, repeated ER visits, visceral injuries. Sexual abuse, the child commonly knows the offender, and the child will be saying stuff that you will not expect a child to say during play. But there are no specific behavioral or psychiatric symptoms. Neglect does not have the obvious signs of maltreatment, but you can see failure to thrive, malnutrition, signs of psychological and physical neglect. Parents are usually overwhelmed, depressed, isolated, parental mental health disorder. So, for example, a depressed mom might just neglect her child, not out of evilness, but because she just can't. And this is the last slide. The course and prognosis, the outcome is multifactorial. Children with mental or physical abnormalities have a poor outcome. Children exposed to longer periods of abuse are at a higher risk of adversities and psychiatric disorders. The treatment is multi-level. You treat the child, the parent. There's also reporting and prevention. Social stigma is an issue. And thank you guys so much for your attention. Well, I really pray that BHS goes well for you. And I know this part is so much more different than the pre-med. صراحة, there are so many things that I just flat out couldn't explain. I'm really disappointed by the fact that I had to straight up read some slides, but there's actually nothing to add without making this 10-hour crash course. I still hope you guys benefited. As usual, this is my contact information. Feel free to send me an email or send me a text, and inshallah I will reply. Or you can scan the QR code for feedback. So, we and GND, we can all improve. And I really wish you guys the best of luck. Again, do practice questions, they're super important. Yeah, that's it. Thank you guys for listening. Assalamu alaikum.